Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the wind howled over the cliffs of Hålogaland, carrying the scent of salt and distant lands. Eirik the Bold stood at the edge, his eyes narrowing as they traced the horizon. Far beyond the waters of the fjord, there was a world rich in treasure, waiting to be taken by those brave enough to seize it. His broad frame, weathered by years of raiding and battle, tensed with the weight of his decision. But his mind was made up. He would raid Lindisfarne and take what belonged to him by right. They say the monks in their white robes carry no weapons, that they kneel to gods of peace. Eirik murmured, half to himself. His lips curled into a smirk. What fools they must be. He turned to face Sigurd, his most trusted warrior and childhood friend. Sigurd's tall, lean frame cast a long shadow on the ground behind him, and the scars on his arms told the story of countless battles fought at Eirik's side. His sharp blue eyes, framed by a mane of wild blonde hair, mirrored Eirik's hunger for glory. Peace, Sigurd spat, scoffing. A gift from weak gods. The All-Father demands blood and iron, not prayers and silence. You've heard the stories. Lindisfarne is filled with silver and gold. The Christian monks guard it like cowards. It will be easy for us. Aye, Eirik replied, his voice lowering. But more than treasure, Sigurd. I want to carve my name into the sagas. The Jarls speak of Lindisfarne, and when we return with its riches, they will speak of me. Sigurd's grin widened, a flash of excitement in his eyes. Then we should gather the men. The seas are calling, and I'm growing tired of this place. Let's give the Skalds something to sing about. Eirik nodded and clasped Sigurd's forearm. Summon the Jarls to the Longhouse. Tonight we decide our course. The Longhouse of Hålogaland was alive with the crackling of fire and the murmur of hushed voices. The Jarls had gathered, seated on thick wooden benches around the hearth. Eirik stood at the head of the hall, his tall frame illuminated by the flickering flames. He watched as they drank their mead, each one lost in their own thoughts, each one weighing the risks of the raid to come. The raid will make us rich beyond our dreams, Eirik began, his voice strong and sure. Lindisfarne is ripe for the taking. The monks pray to their god of peace, but they hide treasures fit for kings. Silver, gold, relics, all there, waiting for us. A murmur rippled through the hall. Some Jarls nodded in agreement, but others exchanged uneasy glances. Harold, a Jarl whose territory bordered Eirik's, rose to his feet. His face, weathered and stern, betrayed no emotion, though his dark eyes burned with intensity. Riches, yes, Harold said slowly. But do you not know the stories, Eirik? The Christian God, this Christ, he is powerful in his own way. His followers have cursed lands before. Some say this raid will bring more than treasure, it will bring doom. Eirik's eyes met Harold's, and for a moment, silence fell over the hall. The tension was palpable. Doom? Eirik echoed, his voice calm but cold. Do you fear the curses of men who hide behind their gods, Harold? Harold's jaw tightened. I fear nothing, but I've heard the tales. They speak of a prophecy, of raids that would call down the wrath of this god, a god of vengeance. I question whether we should risk angering such forces for silver. Eirik stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Let them curse us, he growled, his voice rising. Let them call upon their god. We are Vikings, sons of Odin. We do not bow to their weak gods. We carve our own fates with steel. Sigurd, always quick to support Eirik, rose as well. We did not come here to quiver in fear of foreign gods, Harold. If you are too afraid to sail, then stay behind. But do not speak of doom to us. The Jarls erupted into conversation, voices rising as arguments broke out. Some, like Sigurd, were eager to join the raid, driven by the promise of wealth and glory. Others, like Harold, remained unconvinced, their wariness growing as the talk of prophecies and curses stirred something deep within them. Eric raised his hand for silence, and slowly, the hall fell quiet once more. He walked to the center of the room, his steps deliberate, and spoke with authority. "I do not seek to force any man's hand. If you fear this raid, you may stay behind. But know this, those who come with me will be remembered for generations. Our names will live on in the sagas, and our descendants will walk in the shadow of our greatness. The spoils of Lindisfarne will make us legends." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, Jarls began to nod. First came Jorund, a veteran raider with a grizzled beard and sharp eyes. "I've lived through worse omens," he said with a smirk. "I'll follow you, Eirik." Another Jarl stood, then another, until more than half the hall had pledged their support. Eric felt the weight of their loyalty like a sword in his hand. The raid was happening. Harold remained seated, his face unreadable. But as the Jarls began to discuss preparations, he finally spoke again, his voice low and measured. "May the gods favor you, Eric," he said, "but do not forget, they can be cruel." Eric met Harold's gaze, his expression hard. "The gods test the brave. I will pass their tests." The village hummed with activity. The longship, Hrafn's Fury, loomed large over the shore, its dragon-headed prow pointed toward the open sea. Men gathered in clusters, preparing weapons, securing supplies, and sharing in boasts of the riches they would soon claim. Eric stood at the shore, watching as the crew prepared for the journey. His heart beat faster, a mixture of excitement and unease coursing through his veins. This raid would change everything, he could feel it. But whether for better or worse, he could not say. Sigurd approached, his axe slung over his shoulder. "The ship is nearly ready, we'll sail at first light." Eric nodded but said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Sigurd frowned, noticing his friend's silence. "Are you troubled?" Eric sighed. "It's not fear, Sigurd, but I can't shake the feeling that this raid, it's more than just a raid. Something awaits us on the shores of Lindisfarne. I don't know what it is, but I feel it." Sigurd laughed, clapping him on the back. "It's the thrill of battle, nothing more, you'll see. We'll return with treasure enough to fill 10 halls, and the skalds will sing of our names for centuries." Eric forced a smile. "Aye, perhaps you're right." As the last rays of the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the village in shadow, Eric looked out at the sea. In the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind whispered through the sails of the longship. "The gods test the brave," he muttered to himself, repeating his earlier words, "and I will pass their test." With that, he turned and walked back to the longhouse, the weight of destiny heavy on his shoulders. The sea was endless, a vast expanse of dark, churning water that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. The Hrafn's Fury cut through the waves like a spear through flesh, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the rhythm of the ocean. Above, gray clouds gathered like a shroud obscuring the sun. The sea was a living thing, untamed and angry, and as the Vikings sailed further from the safety of their homeland, the horizon grew ever more foreboding. Eirik stood at the helm, one hand gripping the rudder, the other resting on the hilt of his sword. His eyes scanned the horizon, watching the gathering storm clouds with a growing sense of unease. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. The seas had been unusually rough since they had left Holigaland, and though his men laughed and sang their sea shanties, he knew they too could sense the change in the air. Sigurd stood beside him, his expression grim as he adjusted the sail. "The winds are turning foul, Eirik," he muttered. "We should make for the nearest shore and wait out the storm." Eric shook his head. "There's no time. We've come too far to turn back now. The gods have sent this storm to test us. If we turn away, we prove ourselves weak." Sigurd frowned, glancing up at the blackening sky. "Perhaps, but we're no use to the gods if we drown in their storm. Eric grunted, his jaw tightening. The gods don't reward cowards. We push on. Sigurd opened his mouth to argue, but the sudden crack of thunder cut him off. A bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a roar of wind that made the sails snap and billow. The sea swelled, the waves growing taller and more vicious, slamming against the side of the longship with a force that sent several men stumbling. "Hold the line," Eric bellowed, gripping the rudder tighter as the ship began to tilt dangerously to one side. "Sigurd, secure the sail." Sigurd rushed forward, barking orders at the crew as they scrambled to tie down the rigging. The ship groaned under the pressure of the wind and waves, and the men fought to keep their footing on the slick deck. The rain came next, cold and sharp as needles, drenching the crew in moments. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as the storm raged around them. The sea was angry, and for the first time he felt a flicker of doubt. He had spoken of the gods' tests, but this storm, this fury, it felt different. Was it a warning? Or punishment? A scream cut through the roar of the wind. Eric turned just in time to see one of his men, Hrothgar, lose his footing and tumble over the side of the ship. His hand shot out to grab the railing, but the wet wood slipped from his grasp, and he plunged into the black water below. "Man overboard," Sigurd shouted, but the storm was too wild, the waves too fierce. There was no saving him. Eric's jaw clenched as he watched the sea swallow Hrothgar whole. His death was quick, a brutal reminder of the unforgiving nature of their world. But they had no time to mourn. Another wave crashed over the deck, soaking the men and threatening to tear the ship apart. "We need to lighten the load," Sigurd yelled, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "We're too heavy. The sea will drag us down." Eric hesitated, but he knew Sigurd was right. If they didn't act quickly, they would all be joining Hrothgar in the depths. He raised his voice, shouting over the storm, "Throw the cargo overboard. Anything that isn't tied down goes into the sea." The men obeyed, moving as quickly as they could in the chaos. Crates of supplies, barrels of fresh water, anything that wasn't nailed to the ship was tossed overboard, disappearing into the storm-tossed waves. It was a necessary sacrifice, but Eric couldn't help but feel the sting of loss. Every barrel, every crate, was vital to their survival on the journey ahead. Another wave hit, and the ship lurched violently to the side. Eric gritted his teeth, straining to keep the rudder steady. His muscles burned with the effort, but he refused to let go. His mind raced as the storm showed no sign of relenting. The gods, it seemed, had more to test. Sigurd appeared at his side, his face grim. "We can't keep this up, Eric. We'll lose more men if we don't find shelter soon." Eric nodded, scanning the horizon once more, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something in the distance, a small cluster of rocky islands, barely visible through the rain and mist. "There," he shouted, pointing toward the rocks. "Head for the islands. We can take shelter there." Sigurd nodded and barked orders at the crew, who hurried to adjust the sail. The ship groaned again as it turned, heading toward the distant islands. The waves continued to batter them, but with the promise of shelter in sight, the men fought with renewed determination. The Raffin's fury struggled through the storm, but slowly they began to close the distance. Eric kept his eyes fixed on the rocks, urging the ship forward with every ounce of strength he had left. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged cliffs of the islands. They were close now, but the sea was still wild, and the path to safety was treacherous. The ship creaked and groaned, its timbers straining under the pressure, but it held together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Hrafn's fury sailed into the shelter of the rocky outcrops. The waves still crashed against the ship, but the worst of the storm was behind them. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Drop anchor," he called. "We'll wait out the storm here." The crew moved quickly, dropping the heavy anchor into the water and securing the ship to the rocks. The rain still fell in sheets, but the island offered some protection from the worst of the storm. For the first time since the storm began, Eric allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. Sigurd slumped down beside him, wiping the rain from his face. "We made it," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Barely." Eric nodded, his gaze distant. "Aye. But Hrothgar didn't. Sigurd was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. The sea takes as it pleases. We knew the risks. Eric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Hrothgar's death weighed heavily on him, not because he had been particularly close to the man, but because it was a reminder of how fragile their lives truly were. They had set out in search of glory, but the sea had already claimed one of their own before they had even reached their destination. "We'll mourn him properly when we return," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stared out at the dark water, still churning with fury, and felt a chill settle over him that had nothing to do with the rain. Sigurd followed his gaze, his brow furrowed. "Do you still believe the gods are testing us?" Eric's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I'll be damned if I let the sea, or any god, keep me from what's mine." As the storm raged on, Eric turned away from the sea, his heart hardened. They had survived the first trial, but he knew there would be more to come. Lindisfarne still lay ahead, and with it, the promise of glory, and perhaps a reckoning far greater than he could imagine. The morning broke cold and gray as Hrafn's fury glided silently toward the shores of Lindisfarne. A thick mist clung to the water, shrouding the longship as it cut through the waves like a shadow. Eirik stood at the prow, eyes narrowed as he watched the dark silhouette of the monastery take shape in the distance. The island was still, almost too still, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the sea against the ship's wooden hull. The closer they sailed, the more Eric's heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment that would carve his name into legend. Lindisfarne, a place of untold riches, lay before him like a prize ready to be claimed. But beneath the excitement, a shadow of unease lingered. The storm from the previous day had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and the death of Hrothgar weighed heavily on his mind. "We're nearly there," Sigurd said quietly, standing beside him. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it, a tension that mirrored Eric's own. "The monks won't know what's coming." "Aye," Eric replied, though his gaze remained fixed on the shore. "But stay sharp. This might be easier than most raids, but it's not done until we're on the ship with their gold." Sigurd smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his axe. "We'll be bathing in silver before the sun sets." Eric nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding that clung to him like the mist. He had heard the tales of Lindisfarne, the monks who worshipped a god of peace, the treasures they hoarded, the strange faith they practiced. They were said to be weak, defenseless. Yet there was something unsettling about attacking men who didn't even carry weapons. "They pray to their god for mercy," Eric muttered, almost to himself. "But no gods can save them today." The longship reached the shore with barely a sound. The oarsmen pulled their blades from the water in unison, and the ship coasted the final few feet to the beach. The mist was thick enough to hide their approach, and the walls of the monastery loomed just beyond the trees. Eric signaled to his men and they moved swiftly, silently over the side of the ship, their boots sinking into the wet sand. "We move fast," Eric whispered, his voice sharp as steel. "No mercy. Take everything of value. Burn what you cannot carry. We'll be gone before they can even send word to the king." The warriors nodded in agreement, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They fanned out across the beach, their weapons ready, their breaths coming in low, steady rhythms as they prepared for the kill. Eric could feel the blood pumping through his veins, the familiar rush of battle just moments away. As they crept through the trees, the monastery came into full view. It was a grand building, larger than Eric had imagined, with stone walls and tall wooden doors. The monks moved quietly within the courtyard, dressed in their plain robes, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. Eric's heart hammered in his chest as he watched them, his grip tightening on his sword. "These men fear no steel," Sigurd whispered, a grin spreading across his face. "Their god has made them soft." Eric gave a short nod. "Let's show them what real gods demand. With a single motion of his hand, Eric signaled the attack. His warriors surged forward, a wave of death crashing through the monastery gates. The monks had no time to react, no time to scream. The first of them fell with barely a sound as Eric's blade sliced through flesh and bone. The air was filled with the metallic tang of blood, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. The monastery erupted into chaos. Some monks ran, their feet slipping on the stone paths as they tried to flee into the nearby woods. Others knelt where they stood, praying silently, even as the Vikings descended upon them, their faith in their god unwavering to the last moment. Eric's blade flashed as he cut down another monk, his heart pounding in his chest. Yet with each kill, the gnawing sense of unease grew stronger. These men didn't fight back. They didn't even scream. They simply knelt, their eyes lifted to the sky as if awaiting something. Deliverance, perhaps, or a death they had already accepted. It was not the reaction he had expected. "They don't even fear us," Sigurd grunted, planting his axe into the chest of a monk who made no move to defend himself. "Fools," Eric muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Their god has made them mad." The scene around them was one of carnage. Blood stained the stone walls of the monastery, and the once peaceful courtyard was littered with bodies. Yet the silence that followed the slaughter was deafening. The monks had died without a fight, without so much as a cry for mercy. Eric stood in the center of the courtyard, his sword dripping with blood, his chest heaving. His men had begun to ransack the monastery, tearing down tapestries, smashing open chests filled with gold and silver. The treasure was real, just as the stories had promised. Yet something was wrong. A door at the far end of the courtyard creaked open, and an old monk stepped out, his back hunched with age, his face lined with wisdom and sorrow. His eyes, though, were clear and unwavering as they locked onto Eric's. "Your hands are stained with innocent blood, Viking," the monk said, his voice calm, as if he were addressing a child. "But it is not just gold and silver you have taken this day. You have stolen something far more precious." Eric frowned, his grip tightening on his sword. "You speak riddles, old man. We take what we wish. You were too weak to stop us." The monk stepped forward, his gaze steady and unfaltering. "You do not see it yet, but your fate has already been sealed. The blood you spilled here will haunt your bloodline. You are cursed, Eric the Bold." A cold chill ran through Eric's veins, and for a moment he felt the weight of the monk's words settle over him like a shroud. "Cursed," he spat, forcing a laugh to hide the fear that gnawed at him. "You speak of curses while your god does nothing to save you?" The monk's eyes softened with pity. "It is not your body that will suffer. It is your soul, and the souls of your children. Your name will be remembered, Viking, but not for the glory you seek." Eric's heart thundered in his chest. He took a step forward, raising his sword. "Enough of your lies," he growled, his voice shaking with anger and something else, something darker. "Your god cannot curse me. Only the gods of Asgard hold my fate." The monk shook his head slowly. "You will see." Before Eric could strike, Sigurd appeared at his side, his axe dripping with blood. "Eric, leave him. He's a broken man. There's nothing here for us." Eric hesitated, the old monk's words hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a frustrated snarl, he turned away. "Burn it all," he ordered, his voice colder than the sea wind. "Take what we can carry, and leave nothing behind." As the flames of the burning monastery climbed high into the sky, Eric stood on the beach, watching the black smoke curl into the clouds. His men loaded the stolen treasure onto the ship, their voices filled with excitement as they boasted of their victory. But Eric felt none of their joy. The monk's words echoed in his mind, a quiet whisper that refused to be silenced. "You are cursed, Eric the Bold." Sigurd approached, slapping Eric on the back. "We did it, Eric. The riches of Lindisfarne are ours. You'll be hailed as a hero." Eric forced a smile, though his heart was heavy. "Aye," he said, his voice hollow. "But at what cost?" As the longship pushed off from the shore, carrying them back to Norway with their spoils. Eric's gaze lingered on the burning monastery until it disappeared into the mist. He had sought glory, but all he felt now was a shadow growing within him. The prophecy was like a wound that refused to heal. The Hrafn's fury sailed under dark skies, the wind at their backs as the Viking crew left the smoldering ruins of Lindisfarne behind. The ship was laden with treasure, golden chalices, silver crosses, and fine tapestries draped across barrels. But the weight of their spoils seemed insignificant compared to the heaviness in Eric's heart. The sea, which had once felt like a loyal companion, now churned beneath him like a restless beast. Even the wind seemed to whisper accusations, stirring something deep and unsettling in his chest. Eric stood at the helm, his hands gripping the rough wood of the rudder. The rhythmic sound of the waves did nothing to soothe the turmoil inside him. The words of the old monk echoed in his mind, repeating over and over until they drowned out the voices of his men. "You are cursed, Eric the Bold. It is not your body that will suffer. It is your soul, and the souls of your children." He clenched his jaw, willing himself to push the thought away. He had been through countless raids, seen death in 1,000 forms, yet something about that old man's prophecy had sunk its claws deep into him. He had felt it when the monk spoke. An unfamiliar fear creeping in, something more than the sting of steel, or the uncertainty of battle. Eric. Sigurd's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. His closest companion, bloodied but grinning, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Look at all we've taken. Gold enough to buy us all new halls and feast for months." "Aye," Eric said, his voice distant, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It was a good raid." Sigurd frowned, sensing something off in Eric's tone. "What troubles you?" "You've grown silent since we left the island. The men are celebrating, but you stand here like you've lost more than we've gained." Eric exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the rudder until his knuckles whitened. "It's that monk," he muttered, his voice low. "His words, they cling to me like a bad dream." Sigurd gave a sharp laugh, his eyes gleaming with disdain. "Cursed by a Christian? They can't even lift a sword and you worry about their words? Eric, you've stood against foes far greater than that old man. You're letting his foolishness get into your head." Eric's brow furrowed, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "He didn't seem foolish, Sigurd. There was something in his eyes, something unsettling." Sigurd's grin faded as he studied Eric's face, seeing the doubt creeping into the edges of his hardened exterior. "Eric, listen to me. The gods have always tested you. The All-Father himself watches over you, I've seen it. This monk is nothing. His god is nothing. You're Eric the Bold. There is no curse that can bind you." Eric wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the comfort of Sigurd's words, but the unease gnawed at him still. He turned away from the sea, his gaze settling on the men who sat around the ship's deck, laughing and boasting, their spirits high with victory. Yet there was something else there, something dark. Bjorn, a broad-shouldered warrior with a thick black beard, sat apart from the others, staring down at his hands. His face was pale and his usual fierce demeanor was gone. Eric had noticed the change in him since the raid, how he had grown quieter, more withdrawn. "What's wrong with Bjorn?" Eric asked, his voice soft but tense. Sigurd followed his gaze, his brow furrowing. "He's been like that since we left Lindisfarne. Some of the men have been whispering about what we did there, Eric. They're not used to killing men who don't fight back." Eric grunted, frustration bubbling up inside him. "They are warriors. We take what we want, and we kill those who stand in our way. It's always been this way." Sigurd nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Aye, but those monks, they didn't fight, Eric. They prayed." Eric's temper flared, and he turned to face Sigurd, his voice harsh. "Their weakness is no concern of ours. The men knew what they were signing up for when they boarded the ship. If their hearts are soft, they should never have come." Sigurd held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, shaking his head. Perhaps you're right, but something has changed since that raid. Eric opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Bjorn suddenly rose from his place, his eyes wild. He stumbled toward Eirik and Sigurd, his face pale and covered in sweat. "We should not have done it," he gasped, his voice trembling. "The monks. Their god will punish us. I've seen it in my dreams. They are coming for us." Eric's eyes narrowed, anger flaring in his chest. "What madness is this, Bjorn?" Bjorn shook his head violently, his hands trembling. "I saw them. They stood before me, their eyes white like snow, staring through me. Their god, he is angry, Eirik. He will curse us all." Eirik stepped forward, his face twisted in fury. "Enough! You speak like a frightened child. We are Vikings. No god, no monk, no man can stand against us. You dishonor yourself with this cowardice." Bjorn's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting wildly as if he could see the spirits haunting him even now. "I will not sail with you anymore, Eirik. This raid was wrong. We should have listened to the gods of our people. This is not what the Allfather wanted." Without another word, Bjorn turned and stumbled toward the edge of the ship, as if ready to throw himself overboard. Eirik lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him back. "You will stay on this ship," Eirik growled, his face inches from Bjorn's. "You will see this journey through. You will not speak of curses or gods again." Bjorn's eyes filled with tears, his body shaking uncontrollably. "It's too late. We are already damned." Eirik shoved him back, disgust and anger boiling inside him. "Get below deck before I throw you overboard myself." Bjorn slumped away, his body hunched, muttering under his breath. The other men watched in silence, the joy of their victory fading into a tense unease. Eirik could feel it now. His men were growing restless, their faith in him and the raid faltering. He could sense the doubt spreading like a poison among them, and it filled him with rage. Sigurd, his face grim, stepped closer. "This isn't just about Bjorn. Others are starting to whisper, Eirik. They're questioning whether this raid has brought more than just treasure." Eric's fists clenched, his blood pounding in his ears. "Let them whisper," he spat. "I will not tolerate weakness. If they doubt me, let them speak to my sword." Sigurd's eyes softened, his voice quieter now. "The men have followed you through countless battles, Eirik. They trust you, but something about this raid has shaken them. If you push them too hard now, you might lose more than just their loyalty." Eirik stared at Sigurd, the weight of his words pressing down on him. He felt the anger draining away, leaving behind a hollow pit of uncertainty. His men, his crew, he had led them to victory time and time again. But this was different. The prophecy hung over him like a shadow, and his men could feel it too. For the first time in his life, Eirik wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. "I need time to think," Eirik muttered, turning away from Sigurd. "Watch the men. Keep them in line." Sigurd nodded, his expression somber. "I will. But Eirik, don't let this break you. You're stronger than any curse." Eirik said nothing as he walked to the edge of the ship, staring out over the endless sea. The waves stretched on, cold and unforgiving as the wind howled in his ears. He had sought glory, but now he felt as if he were walking a path toward doom. The gods test the brave, he thought, his heart heavy with doubt. But how much can one man endure? The horizon ahead was dark and uncertain, and for the first time in his life, Eirik felt the weight of fear pressing down upon him. The cold sea wind lashed against Eric's face as Hrafin's fury drifted toward the fog-blanketed shores of Norway. The rhythmic creak of the ship's timbers and the soft slapping of water against the hull were the only sounds that filled the tense air. But aboard the longship, it was not the sea that felt dangerous. It was the growing unrest among the crew. Eirik sat near the prow, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The events of Lindisfarne still weighed heavy on his mind. The monk's curse whispered in his thoughts, and the doubt that had begun to fester among his men was turning into something more dangerous. The atmosphere aboard the ship had changed. What had once been an air of camaraderie and shared purpose had curdled into suspicion and fear. Bjorn's outburst had shaken the crew. His talk of curses and angry gods spread like wildfire through the ranks, and Eirik could see it in their faces. His men were beginning to look at him differently, as though he were the source of their misfortune. Worse still, Harold, his longtime rival, had seized on the unrest, subtly planting seeds of doubt among the warriors, turning them against their chieftain. Eirik's eyes swept across the ship's deck, watching as Harold gathered a small group of men, whispering quietly, their faces grim. Sigurd approached, his expression tight with worry. "They're talking again," Sigurd muttered, casting a glance toward Harold's group. "Harold's been stirring the pot since Bjorn lost his wits. He's telling the men that the gods are angry, that you've brought a curse upon us." Eirik's jaw tightened. "Harold's been waiting for a chance to undermine me. This talk of curses is just his excuse." "Aye," Sigurd agreed, lowering his voice. "But some of the men are listening. You can feel it in the air. They're looking for someone to blame, and Harold is giving them a target." Eirik clenched his fists. He had always known that Harold was ambitious, but the thought of losing his crew's loyalty, of having his leadership questioned, filled him with a cold rage. These men had followed him through countless raids, trusted him with their lives, and now a few words from Harold were enough to shake that trust. It was infuriating. "I'll deal with Harold," Eirik said, his voice low but filled with the promise of violence. "If he wants to challenge my leadership, I'll give him a fight he won't walk away from." Sigurd looked uneasy. "Eirik, you know as well as I do that killing Harold might not solve the problem. The men are already divided. If you strike him down now, it could turn half the crew against you." Eirik's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. "I will not let him poison my men any longer. His challenge is a direct insult to me and the gods. If I don't deal with him now, I lose everything." Sigurd sighed, his concern etched on his face. "Just be careful. There are more ways to win loyalty than with a sword." But Eirik's heart was already hardened. He rose to his feet, his eyes burning with determination. He would not let Harold's whispers destroy him. There was only one way to settle this: by force. He strode toward the group of men gathered around Harold, his steps heavy with purpose. As he approached, the men fell silent, sensing the storm that was about to break. "Harold," Eirik said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've been whispering behind my back for too long." Harold looked up, his dark eyes gleaming with a mix of arrogance and malice. "I only speak the truth, Eirik. The gods are angry. This raid was cursed from the start, and you've led us into their wrath." Eirik's lip curled in disgust. "You speak of the gods, but you only seek to claim my place as chieftain. If you think you're worthy, then challenge me here and now. We'll settle this the way men do." The men around them tensed, glancing at each other as the weight of Eirik's challenge hung in the air. Harold stood slowly, a grin spreading across his face. "Very well, Eirik. I've waited for this moment. The gods will decide who leads this crew." A circle of men quickly formed around them as they cleared a space on the deck. Eirik's heart thundered in his chest, his pulse quickening with the anticipation of battle. He drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the pale light of the fog. Harold unsheathed his own weapon, a heavy axe that he spun confidently in his hands. The two men faced each other, the tension crackling between them like the air before a storm. The crew watched in silence, their eyes wide as they prepared to witness the clash of their two fiercest warriors. "For years you've schemed behind my back, Harold," Eirik growled, his voice low and dangerous. "But your time has come. When I'm done with you, the gods will know who stands as their true servant." Harold laughed, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll see, Eirik. Perhaps it is you the gods want to punish." With a roar, Harold lunged forward, swinging his axe in a deadly arc toward Eirik's chest. Eirik was quick, stepping to the side and raising his sword to parry the blow. Steel met steel with a resounding clang, and the force of the impact sent a jolt through Eirik's arms. The two men circled each other, eyes locked in a deadly dance. Harold attacked again, this time aiming for Eirik's legs. Eric dodged the blow, bringing his sword down in a swift counterstrike that Harold barely deflected with his axe. The fight was brutal and fast, each man testing the other's strength, their weapons clashing in a blur of movement. Sweat dripped down Eric's brow as he fought, his muscles straining with every swing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was more than just a fight for leadership. It was a fight for his legacy, for his honor. Every strike was filled with the rage and frustration that had been building inside him since Lindisfarne. Harold's grin began to falter as Eric's strikes came faster, harder. The realization that he had underestimated Eric was written in his eyes. He swung wildly, trying to land a decisive blow, but Eric was ready. He ducked under Harold's axe, spinning around him with the speed of a wolf, and with a swift upward slash his sword found its mark. Harold gasped, stumbling backward as blood poured from a deep gash across his chest. His axe slipped from his hands and clattered to the deck. He collapsed to his knees, his face pale with shock and pain. Eric stood over him, his sword raised high, the edge glistening with Harold's blood. The crew held their breath, watching in stunned silence as their chieftain loomed over the defeated rival. "You will not question my leadership again," Eric said, his voice cold as ice. "The gods have spoken." With one swift motion, Eric drove his sword through Harold's chest, ending his life in an instant. The body slumped to the deck, lifeless. The crew stared in wide-eyed silence, the only sound the creaking of the ship as it rocked gently in the water. Eric pulled his sword free and turned to face the men. "Let this be a lesson to any who doubt me," he said, his voice ringing out over the deck. "We are Vikings. We follow strength, not fear. I will lead us to greater victories. Any man who stands against me will meet the same fate as Harold." The crew lowered their heads in submission, their loyalty to Eric restored. But as he wiped the blood from his sword, the cold realization settled in his chest. He had won the battle, but the monk's prophecy still hung over him like a dark cloud. The gods test the brave, he thought, staring down at Harold's lifeless body. But how much more will they demand? As the longship sailed into the fog, Eric felt the weight of his actions pulling him deeper into a future filled with uncertainty, the shadow of the curse growing ever darker. The shores of Norway loomed ahead, jagged and dark beneath the storm-gray sky. The land that had once brought Eric comfort now filled him with a strange emptiness. The long journey across the North Sea was finally ending, yet the unease he carried since Lindisfarne had only deepened. The death of Harold had restored his crew's loyalty, but it had done nothing to quiet the doubts that haunted him like ghosts. The Hrafn's fury cut through the calm waters as it approached the fjord, the sails slack in the light breeze. Eirik stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the distant village that would soon come into view. Behind him, the crew moved about with muted energy, their usual boisterous talk replaced by silence. The treasure they had taken from Lindisfarne glittered beneath the deck, but it felt like a curse rather than a reward. They had paid for it in blood and unease, and now they were returning to a world that had shifted in ways none of them could fully understand. Sigurd approached Eirik, his footsteps cautious as if even he could sense the weight of their homecoming. "We'll be back by sundown," he said, his voice quiet, though it carried the same strength as always. "The men are restless. It's been a long journey, and they want to feel the earth beneath their feet." Eirik nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the distant mountains. "They have earned their rest." Sigurd was silent for a moment, watching Eirik with concern. "And you? Have you earned yours?" Eric's hand clenched on the hilt of his sword, the familiar sensation grounding him, but the heaviness in his chest didn't lift. "Rest? I don't know if I'll ever find it." Sigurd frowned, stepping closer. "You've done what was needed, Eirik. We raided Lindisfarne, brought back riches that will make you the most powerful jarl in Norway. You killed Harold when he challenged you, and the men now look to you as their leader. What more could you want?" Eric's jaw tightened, his voice low and full of frustration. "I don't want their gold. I don't care for their treasure. Ever since we left that cursed island, I feel hollow. The old monk's words cling to me, Sigurd. I can't shake the feeling that he was right. That we've brought something dark with us. Sigurd scoffed, though his expression softened with concern. You've let that old man get into your head. We've faced worse omens, worse curses. The gods will guide us as they always have. Eric's eyes darkened, his voice barely a whisper. What if the gods are the ones who've cursed us? Sigurd had no answer for that. He looked at Eric, the weight of their journey pressing down on him as well. Finally, he placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, squeezing it with a brotherly grip. Whatever curse we may face, we'll face it together, Eric. You are not alone. Eric nodded but said nothing. The weight of leadership was pressing on him more than ever, and no amount of reassurance could lift it. The words of the monk, the curse that had been placed on him, felt like a shadow clinging to his soul. Even now, as they neared home, it felt like the shadow was following them, growing darker with each passing moment. The village of Hålogaland came into view as the longship rounded the bend of the fjord, its familiar sight bringing no comfort to Eirik. The homes of his people nestled between the towering cliffs, the longhouse rising tall above the village, smoke curling from its chimney. The shore was already bustling with villagers who had spotted the returning ship, their excitement palpable as they anticipated the treasure the raiders had brought back. But Eric felt none of their joy. As the ship touched the shore and the men leapt into the shallow waters, cheers erupted from the villagers. Eric stepped onto the shore with Sigurd beside him, his face set in a grim line. He could see the anticipation in the eyes of the villagers, the excitement at the sight of the heavy chests being unloaded from the ship. But something felt wrong, something in the air, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. A woman, Runa, approached Eric. She was one of the elders of the village, respected for her wisdom and her connection to the old gods. Her gray hair fell in thick braids over her shoulders, and her eyes were sharp as they fixed on Eric. There was no joy in her expression, only quiet concern. "Eric," she greeted him, her voice calm but carrying an edge of something darker. "You've returned victorious, but I sense that all is not well." Eric met her gaze, feeling a strange chill run through him. "We've brought treasure, more than the village has ever seen. But Lindisfarne, something is wrong. The old monk we encountered, he cursed us." Runa's eyes narrowed, her hands clutching the staff she carried. "A curse from a Christian monk?" Eric nodded, his voice heavy with the weight of the words he had been carrying. "He said our raid would doom us, that the blood we spilled would bring ruin to my lineage." Runa remained silent for a moment, her sharp eyes studying him, searching for something beneath the surface of his words. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "The gods are watching, Eric. You know this. They test us, push us to the edge to see if we are worthy of their blessings. Perhaps this curse is not the doing of the Christian God, but the All-Father himself." Eric's chest tightened at her words, the truth of them cutting deeper than he had expected. "Then what must I do to lift it? How do I appease the gods?" Runa's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "If the gods have turned their gaze to you, it is because you have something they desire, your strength, your will. But you must prove yourself. Sacrifice, Eirik. That is the only way to balance the scales." Eric clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Sacrifice. He had given so much already. His men had followed him into battle, Harold had died by his hand, and the weight of the treasure was heavy in their possession. But what more would the gods ask of him? "I'll do what is necessary," Eric said, though his voice was strained. "But what must I sacrifice?" Runa stepped closer, her gaze piercing through him. "You must look into your heart. The gods demand that which is most precious to you. Only then can the curse be lifted." Eric's stomach twisted at her words. His mind raced through the possibilities. What could be more precious than his crew, his strength, his life? His thoughts turned to his family. His son, Håkon, waiting for him in the village. The realization hit him like a hammer blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He could never sacrifice Håkon. He could never give up his son. But if the gods demanded it, what choice did he have? As the sun dipped low over the horizon, Casting long shadows across the village, Eric felt the darkness close in around him. The cheers of the villagers rang hollow in his ears, and the treasure they had brought back seemed more like a curse than a blessing. Eric turned away from Runa, his heart heavy, and walked toward the longhouse. Sigurd followed him, silent but loyal, as always. But Eric felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The gods had tested him, and now he faced a choice that could break him. How much was he willing to sacrifice to lift the curse that hung over his head? What would it cost to free himself from the shadow that had followed him home? And as he entered the longhouse, the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a mountain. The longhouse was darker than Eirik remembered. The familiar crackle of the fire in the hearth should have been a comfort, but now it seemed distant, cold. Shadows flickered across the walls, dancing like ghosts as Eirik sat at the head of the hall, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his oak throne. Around him, his closest jarls and warriors gathered, but their voices were tense, subdued. The treasure they had brought back from Lindisfarne lay in chests along the wall, glittering in the dim light, but it felt more like a burden than a triumph. The air in the longhouse was heavy with unspoken tension, and Eirik knew why. The curse. The old monk's words had settled over the village like a fog, infecting the minds of his people. Some had begun whispering of dark omens, of strange dreams and ill fortunes that had befallen them since the raiders returned. The village seemed divided. Some still saw Eirik as the bold leader who had brought back riches, but others looked at him as if he were cursed. And then, there was the matter of Harold's death. His followers were still smarting from their jarl's defeat, and though they had not yet openly challenged Eirik's leadership, the resentment was palpable. Even now, as the jarls gathered in the longhouse, their loyalty felt uncertain. The cracks in his rule were widening, and Eirik could feel them threatening to split his kingdom apart. Sigurd stood beside him, his face shadowed by the firelight, watching the gathered jarls with a careful eye. He at least was unwavering in his loyalty. But even Sigurd had grown quieter since their return, as if sensing the storm brewing on the horizon. Eirik, Jorund, one of the older jarls, spoke up from his place near the hearth. His voice was rough with age, but there was still strength in it. "We've all heard the rumors. The men speak of a curse, of doom brought upon us by the raid on Lindisfarne." Eirik's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. "Rumors," he growled. "Nothing more than the fears of weak-minded fools. We brought back riches, more gold and silver than this village has ever seen. What curse do they speak of?" Jorund shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the other jarls. "The men say that ever since we returned, strange things have been happening. Crops have withered, livestock have died, some of the women have fallen ill, and the seers speak of dark omens." Eirik's chest tightened. He had noticed it too, the quiet rot spreading through the village, the sickness that clung to the air like a poisonous fog. But he had pushed it aside, refusing to believe that it was anything more than coincidence. Now, hearing it spoken aloud by one of his jarls, it was harder to ignore. "It is the Christian god's curse," came another voice. Ragnar, a younger jarl with a scar running down the side of his face. He had been one of Harold's supporters, and his eyes gleamed with suspicion as he looked at Eirik. "We were warned by Harold not to raid Lindisfarne, but you ignored him. And now, look what has come of it." Sigurd stepped forward, his voice firm as steel. "Harold was a coward, and he paid for his betrayal with his life. Eirik is our leader, chosen by the gods themselves. If you doubt him, then you doubt the gods." Ragnar sneered but said nothing, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a blade. Eirik could see the flicker of doubt in some of the jarls' eyes, even those who had once stood by him. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the curse, was spreading faster than he could contain it. Eirik rose from his throne, his voice commanding the room. "I will not listen to tales of curses and omens like frightened children. We are Vikings. We do not cower before the words of dying monks." The treasure we brought back is proof of our strength, not a sign of doom. The Jarls watched him, their expressions hard to read. Some nodded, but others remained silent, their eyes shifting uneasily. Eric could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down on him, threatening to crush his authority. He had to act, to show them that he was still in control. "We will make an offering to the gods," Eric continued, his voice steady, though his heart beat faster in his chest. "If the gods are displeased, we will appease them. We will sacrifice what is necessary to lift this shadow from our village." Ragnar snorted, folding his arms across his chest. "And what will you sacrifice, Eirik? More gold? Or will you offer something more precious?" Eric's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice measured. "Whatever the gods demand, I will give. But do not mistake me, Ragnar. I will not be cowed by fear. The gods test us, yes, but they do not abandon the strong." Ragnar met Eric's gaze with a cold smile. "Then let us hope you are right. For if you are not, it is not just your head that will pay the price, but all of ours." The hall fell into a heavy silence, the tension crackling in the air like a brewing storm. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm, refusing to show weakness. He would not let the Jarls see his doubt, his fear. To do so would be to lose everything. After a long, tense moment, Yoren spoke again, his voice softer this time. "An offering may calm the gods, but we must be prepared, Eric. If the curse remains, if the gods demand more." Eric nodded, though the weight of Yoren's words pressed down on him like a mountain. "We will do what is necessary." The Jarls began to disperse, some murmuring quietly among themselves, others casting glances at Eric as they left the longhouse. Sigurd remained at Eric's side, his brow furrowed in concern. "They're afraid," Sigurd said quietly, watching the last of the Jarls leave. "The talk of curses has them rattled. If the offering doesn't lift this shadow, they'll turn on you." Eric sighed, the exhaustion of leadership weighing heavy on his shoulders. "I know. But what can I do, Sigurd? The monk's words, the sickness in the village. It's as if everything is slipping from my grasp." Sigurd placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You've faced worse than this, Eric. You've fought for your place and you've earned it. The gods have tested you before and you've passed every trial." Eric looked into the flames of the hearth, his mind swirling with doubt and fear. "But what if this is different, Sigurd? What if this is a test I cannot pass?" Sigurd's eyes softened. "Then we will face it together. But remember, you are Eric the Bold. You do not bow to fear. You bend the world to your will." Eric nodded, though the weight of the coming storm still hung heavy in his heart. "Tomorrow we will make the offering. And if the gods demand more..." He let the words hang in the air, unfinished but understood. The gods demanded sacrifice, and Eric knew he would have to give them something greater than gold if he was to save his people and his legacy. As the fire crackled in the longhouse, Eric sat back down on his throne, the weight of leadership pressing heavier than ever. He had won battles, conquered foes, but this unseen enemy, this curse, felt different. It was a fight he could not win with a sword. And as the night deepened, the shadows seemed to grow longer, and Eric knew that the real battle was yet to come. Tomorrow the gods would speak, and Eric would have to answer. But what they would ask of him, he could only fear. The morning dawned cold and bleak, the sky a pale gray blanket that stretched endlessly over Halogaland. The sea, usually teeming with life and motion, lay still as death, a mirror reflecting the heavy mood that had settled over the village. It was as if even the gods had grown silent, watching from their thrones in Asgard as the fateful day began. Eirik stood outside the longhouse, his breath misting in the frigid air. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the weight he carried. Today, they would make the offering, an attempt to lift the curse that hung over them like a black cloud. But Eric knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough. He had felt it growing inside him since they returned from Lindisfarne. The darkness, the doubt, the curse that had burrowed its way into his very soul. As the villagers gathered in the central square, their faces grim and expectant, Eric scanned the crowd for his son Håkon. The boy was only 10 winters old, but already there was a strength in him that made Eric proud. Håkon stood beside his mother, Freydis, who watched Eirik with a mixture of worry and quiet resolve. She had always been his rock, the one person who never wavered in her belief in him. But even she had sensed the change in him, though she never spoke of it. Eirik caught Håkon's eye and gave him a small nod. The boy nodded back, his face serious, trying to mimic the warriors around him. Eirik's chest tightened with pride and fear. He had done everything for his son, to ensure that Håkon would inherit a kingdom, a legacy of strength and glory. But now that future seemed uncertain. Sigurd appeared at his side, his face set in grim determination. "The men are ready," he said quietly, gesturing to the group of warriors who stood around the altar at the center of the square. "They trust you, Eirik. They believe this offering will appease the gods." Eirik grunted, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "Let's hope they're right." The altar had been prepared the night before, a rough-hewn slab of stone covered in fresh animal skins and marked with runes of protection. Runa, the village seeress, stood by the altar, her hands raised to the sky, her voice chanting in a low, steady rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of burning herbs, and the villagers gathered around the square in silence, watching as Eirik and his warriors approached. Runa's chanting grew louder as Eirik stepped forward. The villagers' eyes were on him, and he could feel their hopes and fears pressing down on him like a great weight. He was their leader, their chieftain, and it was up to him to lift this curse. But how? How could he fight something he couldn't see, something that lived in the shadows of their hearts? Runa's voice rose in a final crescendo before she lowered her arms and turned to face Eirik. Her eyes were sharp, gleaming with the intensity of her vision, and she spoke with the authority of one who had communed with the gods. "Eirik, son of Håkon, you have called upon the gods for their favor," she intoned, her voice echoing across the square. "You seek to lift the curse that has befallen this village, to restore balance and peace. The gods are watching. They will judge your offering." Eirik nodded, stepping closer to the altar. His warriors brought forward the animals, 2 oxen and a boar, prepared for sacrifice. Their throats would be slit, their blood spilled upon the altar as an offering to Odin, Thor, and Freya. But even as he watched the animals struggle against their bindings, Eirik's mind raced. Would this be enough? Could a few beasts satisfy the gods, when so much death and blood had already stained his hands? Runa raised her arms once more, calling upon the gods to accept the offering. The warriors stepped forward, blades in hand, ready to spill the blood of the animals in sacrifice. But before they could move, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Wait!" It was Bjorn, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. The man had grown more unhinged since their return from Lindisfarne, his mind clearly broken by the monk's curse. Now he stumbled forward, pushing his way through the crowd, his voice shaking with terror. "This is not enough," Bjorn cried, his voice hoarse. "The gods demand more than animals. They demand a greater sacrifice." The villagers murmured among themselves, fear flickering in their eyes as they watched Bjorn. Eirik felt a surge of anger rise in him. He had barely kept control of the village as it was, and now Bjorn's madness threatened to undo everything. "Silence, Bjorn," Eirik growled, stepping forward. "The gods will take what we offer them. This madness has gone on long enough." But Bjorn would not be silenced. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild, his hands raised as if pleading with them to listen. "You don't understand. The gods are angry. They want more. They want the blood of a true leader. Only then will the curse be lifted." A chill ran down Eirik's spine. He could see the fear in the villagers' faces, the uncertainty in the eyes of his warriors. Bjorn's words were planting seeds of doubt, and those seeds were quickly taking root. But it wasn't just the villagers. Deep down, in the darkest corners of Eric's mind, a terrible thought began to form. A thought that echoed the monk's words, the curse that had been spoken over him. The gods demand a greater sacrifice. They demand something precious. Before Eric could respond, Runa stepped forward, her face impassive but her eyes full of something Eric couldn't quite read. "Eric," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the gods. "Bjorn may be mad, but his words hold truth. The gods may indeed demand something more." Eric's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears. "What more can I give them?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Runa's gaze shifted toward Hakon, standing by his mother at the edge of the crowd. The moment stretched out in agonizing silence as if time itself had frozen. Eric's blood ran cold, his stomach twisting with dread. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not him." Runa's eyes were full of pity, but there was no wavering in her voice. "The gods demand the most precious thing, Eric. They demand your son." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Freydis instinctively pulled Hakon closer to her face pale with shock. Eric felt as though the world had fallen away beneath him. His legs were weak, his breath shallow. Hakon, his son, the one thing he had fought so hard to protect, the reason he had sought glory in the first place. "No," Eric said again, louder this time. "I will not sacrifice him." Runa stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Eric, if the curse is to be lifted, this is what the gods demand. They have given you the strength to lead, but now they ask for this in return." Eric's vision blurred with rage and sorrow. "I won't do it," he roared, his voice echoing through the square. "There has to be another way." The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for his decision. But Eric's mind was a storm, his heart breaking under the weight of the choice before him. He had never known fear like this. Not in battle, not in the face of death. This was something deeper, something primal. How could he sacrifice his son? How could he let the gods take the one thing he loved more than anything? Hakon's eyes met his, wide and full of trust, as if the boy knew nothing of the terrible fate that had been placed before him. Eric's chest tightened, and his throat burned with unshed tears. He had never cried before, not in battle, not even when his own father had died. But now, faced with the impossible, he felt his heart breaking. Runa's voice cut through his thoughts. "The decision is yours, Eric, but know this, the curse will not be lifted unless the gods are appeased." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eric stood there, torn between his duty as a leader and his love as a father. The villagers watched, waiting for him to speak, but all he could do was stare at his son, his heart shattering with every passing moment. Finally Eric spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There must be another way." The long night stretched on as the village of Halogaland fell under an oppressive silence. The weight of the gods' demand hung heavy in the air, thick as fog, choking the breath from Eric's lungs. He stood outside the longhouse, staring into the flickering flames of the village torches. The words of Runa, the seeress, echoed in his mind, filling him with dread. "The gods demand the most precious thing, Eric. They demand your son, Hakon, his boy, his legacy, the very reason he had fought, bled, and sought glory. How could the gods be so cruel as to ask this of him?" His heart ached with a sorrow so deep it felt like his soul was being torn apart. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who had always faced his enemies without fear. But now he faced an enemy he could not fight, an enemy within himself. Freydis approached him, her steps quiet and sure. She had been watching him from the shadows of the longhouse, her face pale with fear and anger, her eyes red from tears that she had refused to shed in front of the others. She was a warrior's wife, strong, proud, but even she could not hide the anguish of what the gods demanded. "Eric," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "we must find another way. You cannot..." We cannot lose him. Not our son. Eric clenched his fists, his knuckles white with tension. He turned to face her, and for the first time he allowed the despair he felt to show in his eyes. Fridas, what would you have me do? The gods have spoken. If I refuse them, the curse will fall upon us all. Fridas shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. No. It's not just about us, it's about Håkon. You've fought your entire life for him, for his future. And now you're going to throw him to the gods like he's nothing? He's your blood, Eric. He's our blood. Eric's voice cracked with pain. You think I don't know that? You think I want this? I would give my own life 1,000 times over before I let the gods take him. But what choice do I have? They demand it. Frida stepped forward, her hands gripping his tunic, her voice shaking with fury and grief. No, the gods do not demand this. Runa demands it. That mad seeress and her visions. You are the leader of this village, not her. If you choose to defy the gods, the men will follow you. They will stand with you, and we will find another way to lift this curse. Eric looked at her, the fire in her eyes giving him strength for a moment. But then the weight of reality settled on his shoulders once more. And if I defy them and the curse takes hold? What then? The crops will wither, the children will die in their cradles, and Håkon will suffer a worse fate than sacrifice. We will all be damned. Fridas released him and stepped back, her eyes brimming with tears now. You're already damning him, Eric. Her words pierced him like an arrow, and he turned away, his mind spinning. His heart screamed for him to run, to grab Håkon and Fridas and flee into the wilderness. But he knew it would be futile. The gods' reach was long, and their judgment would follow him wherever he went. There was no escaping this. The village was quiet, the torches casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to mock him. As the weight of the decision bore down on him, Eric felt himself sinking into despair. He was a man of action, of decisive will, but now he stood at the edge of an abyss, unsure of how to save his people or his son. From the darkness, Sigurd approached, his face hard and grim. He had stood by Eirik's side for years, fought with him in countless battles, but now even he seemed unsure. Eric, he began softly. The men are restless. They've heard what Runa said. They believe the gods will destroy us if we don't act. Eric's jaw tightened. And what do you believe, Sigurd? Sigurd's eyes narrowed as he studied his old friend. I believe in you, Eric. I always have. But the men, they're afraid. If they lose faith in you, they might turn on you. The thought sent a shiver through Eric's spine. He had already seen signs of rebellion, cracks in the loyalty of his people. Bjorn's madness had fanned the flames of doubt, and now it was spreading like a disease. If he didn't act soon, the curse would be the least of his problems. They want my son's blood, Eric said, his voice hollow. Sigurd hesitated, then nodded slowly. Some believe it is the only way to save the village, to lift the curse. Eric closed his eyes, his chest heaving with the weight of the decision. He felt the cold, crushing pressure of fate closing in around him. The gods were watching. His people were watching. Every breath, every beat of his heart brought him closer to the moment he feared most. Suddenly, a voice called out from the shadows. I will not let this happen. Eric turned to see Håkon standing in the doorway of the longhouse. The boy's face was pale but determined, his small fists clenched at his sides. His mother had been right. There was strength in him, a fierce, unyielding spirit that Eric had never fully seen before. Håkon, Eric said, his voice breaking. You don't understand. I do, Håkon said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. You're going to sacrifice me to save the village, but I won't let you. Freydis moved to his side, placing her hand on his shoulder, her face wet with tears. Håkon, no. Håkon looked up at his father, his eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not afraid, Father. I'm not afraid of death. But I am afraid of what it will do to you. If you let them take me, you'll never be the same. The gods may forgive you, but you will never forgive yourself." Eric felt the air leave his lungs. His son's words were like a blade cutting through his heart. Haakon's bravery, his defiance, only made the decision harder. How could he, a father, willingly send his boy to die, even if it meant saving his people? Tears blurred Eric's vision as he sank to his knees before his son, gripping his shoulders. "Haakon, you are the strongest thing I've ever known. I don't know what to do." Haakon placed his hand on Eric's arm, his voice soft but unyielding. "You know what to do, father. The gods don't want this. We can find another way." For a moment the world seemed to pause. The weight of the gods' demand, the fear of his people, the curse that had been spoken, it all pressed down on Eric. But now, in the face of his son's courage, something shifted inside him. Rising to his feet, Eric turned to Sigurd, his jaw set. "Prepare the men." Sigurd looked at him, confused. "For what?" "We're going to face the gods, Sigurd," Eric said, his voice full of iron. "But I will not sacrifice my son. If the gods demand a greater price, then I will give it myself." The decision sent a ripple through the air. The gods were watching, but Eric would not let them break him. He had made his choice. He would face whatever judgment came, but Haakon's blood would not be spilled. As Eric marched toward the center of the village, his warriors gathering around him, the sky above began to darken. The storm was coming, but Eric the Bold would face it head-on as he always had, and this time he would fight for more than just his honor. He would fight for his son, for his legacy, and for his very soul. The gods had demanded a sacrifice. Eric would give them everything, except his son. The skies above Hålogaland had grown dark, a roiling mass of clouds that churned like the sea in a storm. Lightning crackled across the heavens, the sharp scent of rain mixing with the cold, briny air. The gods were watching. Eric stood at the center of the village square, his feet planted firmly on the earth, his heart beating like a war drum in his chest. His sword hung at his side, not drawn, but ready. His eyes were fixed on the altar, the place where Runa had demanded the blood of his son, Haakon, as an offering to the gods. But Eric had made his choice. He would defy the gods themselves if it meant saving his boy. The village had gathered, their faces grim and uncertain. Whispers carried through the crowd, eyes flicking from Eric to the darkened sky. Some still believed in the curse that only the blood of Haakon could lift it. Others, seeing the determination in Eric's eyes, were unsure. Would their chieftain's defiance be enough? Or would it doom them all? Freda stood behind Haakon, her arms wrapped protectively around him. Her face was set, pale but fierce. She had always been his strength, his guiding star in the darkest of times. Now, as the storm gathered overhead, she held her son close, her faith in Eirik unshaken. Sigurd stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern but his loyalty unwavering. "Eirik," he said quietly, "are you sure about this? If we defy the gods, there may be no turning back." Eric's gaze did not waver. "I have never been more sure of anything, Sigurd. I will not sacrifice my son. If the gods demand blood, they will take mine." Sigurd nodded, the tension in his face easing just a little. "Then we stand with you, my friend, whatever comes." Eirik turned to face the crowd, raising his voice to be heard over the gathering wind. "People of Hålogaland, the gods have tested us, demanded a sacrifice to lift the curse that hangs over our village. But I say this, I will not give them my son. The gods are not cruel. They do not demand the blood of the innocent. If we are to be judged, let it be me who stands before them. I, Eirik the Bold, will offer myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of fear and admiration. Eric had been their leader for years, a man of strength and honor, a warrior who had never faltered in the face of danger. But now he stood on the edge of something far greater than any raid or battle. He stood on the edge of fate itself. Runa, the village seeress, stepped forward from the shadows, her eyes dark and inscrutable. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of the god's will. "Eric," she said softly, "the gods have spoken. They asked for the blood of your son. If you defy them, you risk bringing their wrath upon all of us." Eric's eyes burned as he met her gaze. "No god would demand the death of a child, Runa. I do not believe it. If the gods wish to punish us, then they can take me. I will bear the curse myself." Runa's gaze flickered with something, pity, perhaps, or doubt, but she nodded slowly. "Very well, Eric. The gods will decide." Eric stepped forward to the altar, where the blood of animals had already been spilled in vain, and knelt before it. His sword gleamed at his side, the hilt worn from years of battle. He looked up to the sky, his heart pounding in his chest. He did not fear death, not for himself, but the thought of leaving Freydis and Håkon behind, vulnerable and unprotected, sent a stab of sorrow through him. But if this was the price to be paid, he would pay it. He closed his eyes and whispered to the gods, "I am here. Take me if you must, but spare my son. Let this curse fall on me." The wind howled, swirling around him like a living thing. The sky grew darker still, and the first drops of rain fell, cold and heavy. The air crackled with energy, and the villagers drew back, murmuring in fear. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the sky, and thunder boomed so loud it seemed to shake the very earth. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees in terror. Eric did not flinch. He kept his eyes closed, waiting for the god's judgment, his heart steady in his chest. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm, the roar of the wind and rain. And then, as if the world itself had paused, a voice, deep and resonant, seemed to echo through the air. It was not a human voice, but something older, something vast and terrible. "Eric, you have chosen wisely." Eric's eyes flew open, and the world around him seemed to shimmer with a strange light. The storm, still fierce, no longer felt like a threat but a presence, an overwhelming force that pressed down on him. The voice of the gods. It filled his mind, his very soul, and for the first time, he felt their gaze upon him, like the weight of mountains. "You have offered yourself in place of your son. This sacrifice we accept." The voice reverberated through his bones, shaking him to his core. Eric's breath came in short gasps, but he held his ground. He would not run from this. He had chosen his fate. But then, the voice softened, and with it, a strange warmth spread through the air. "Your love for your son has moved us, Eric. The curse will be lifted. Your sacrifice has been noticed. You will live, but you will carry the weight of this burden all your days. Remember this lesson well." The light flared brighter, and then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The wind died down, the storm clouds began to part, and the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. The oppressive weight that had hung over the village lifted, and the crowd stared in stunned silence. Eric slowly rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice of the gods was gone, but their words lingered in his mind. He had been spared, but the burden of his choice, of what might have been, would stay with him forever. Freydis rushed to his side, her face streaked with tears, her arms wrapping tightly around him. "Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The gods, they spared you." Eric nodded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Aye, they spared us all." Håkon stood a few paces away, his young face full of awe and fear. Eric knelt before him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Håkon, you're safe," Eric whispered. "The gods have lifted the curse." Håkon clung to his father, his voice small. "I wasn't afraid, father." Eric pulled back, his eyes meeting his son's. "You were braver than any warrior I've ever known, my boy." Sigurd approached, his face pale but relieved. "The storm has passed, Eric. The village is safe." Eric looked around at the gathered villagers, who now stood in awe, their fear replaced by reverence. He had defied the gods, and they had listened. His people were safe, and his son was spared. But as Eric looked up at the clearing sky, the burden of the gods' words pressed down on him. He had been willing to sacrifice everything for his son, and in return, the gods had shown mercy, but at a price. He would carry the weight of this moment forever. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Eric stood tall, his heart full of love for his family, his people, and the life he had fought to protect. He had faced the gods and emerged victorious, but he knew now that true strength did not lie in sword or shield. It lay in the love that binds a man to his family. The cold wind howled through the fjord as the flames leapt higher, consuming the wooden pyre. Ragnhild Sverker stood motionless, her face painted with the flickering light of the fire, as her brother's body was swallowed by the blaze. Bjorn Sverker, once the pride of the clan, now lay wrapped in linen, his sword placed beside him as tradition demanded. Around her the Sverker clan stood in silence, their heads bowed, their faces hard with grief and anger. The scent of burning wood and herbs filled the air, but all Ragnhild could smell was blood. The blood of her brother, spilled in a coward's ambush by the cursed gunners. Her hand clenched the hilt of her own sword, her knuckles white. It had been 3 days since the news arrived that Bjorn had been cut down in the woods, his body left for wolves. He had gone out hunting, unarmored and unsuspecting. The feud between the Sverkers and the gunners had been smoldering for years, but this was a brazen act of war. As the last of the flames began to die, her father, Ulf Sverker, chieftain of their clan, stepped forward. He had once been a giant of a man, feared across the fjords for his strength in battle, but now his shoulders sagged under the weight of age and sorrow. His voice, though cracked with grief, carried the authority of a lifetime of leadership. Bjorn Sverker has gone to the halls of our ancestors, Ulf declared, raising his arms to the night sky. He has been taken from us by the treachery of the gunners, but he shall not be forgotten. His spirit watches us now from Valhalla, where the brave feast, and we, his kin, shall see his death avenged. A roar of approval rose from the gathered warriors, but Ragnhild remained silent, her eyes fixed on the embers. Avenged. It was a word she had heard 100 times since her brother's death. The Sverker way was clear. Blood demanded blood. And yet something gnawed at her, something beyond the desire for vengeance. She did not want to think about it, but the questions lingered. What would another cycle of bloodshed bring? How many more would die before this feud was ended? Her father stepped toward her, his voice quieter now but full of the same intensity. Ragnhild, my daughter, you must take up your brother's place. You are the last of my children, and our family's honor rests on you now. Will you let Bjorn's death go unanswered? Ragnhild's heart pounded in her chest as she met her father's gaze. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes still held the same fierce determination that had guided their clan through countless battles. She saw the expectation in them, the pressure of generations. I will not let his death go unanswered, father, Ragnhild said, her voice steady though her mind whirled. The gunners will pay for what they have done. Ulf nodded, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. Good. We will call for a thing, a gathering of all our allies. This feud will end with the destruction of the gunners. Ragnhild swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling on her like a cloak of iron. She looked back to the fire, now just glowing embers. Her brother's face flashed in her memory, his wide smile, his loud laugh. He had been the golden son, always destined to lead their clan. Now, it fell to her to carry that mantle. But could she? Could she truly lead them to the war that was coming? As the pyre burned down to nothing, her mother Ingrid approached. Unlike Ulf, her face was calm, her eyes sharp. She had been silent during the ceremony, but Ragnhild knew her mother's mind was always working. Ingrid had been raised in a family of jarls, and she understood the way of Viking politics better than most. Ragnhild, her mother said softly, come, we must talk. They walked together to the edge of the village, where the land sloped down to the black waters of the fjord. The moon cast a silver sheen across the waves, and the air was heavy with the coming snow. When they were alone, Ingrid spoke. "Your father means to start a war, and I know you are ready to follow him. But you must think carefully, daughter. A blood feud is a fire that does not burn out easily. It consumes everything in its path." Ragnhild's brow furrowed. "What choice do we have? They killed Bjorn. How can we not answer that?" "I am not saying we should do nothing," Ingrid replied, her eyes flashing with that same calculating look she always wore when discussing matters of power. "But war with the Gunners will not end as simply as you might think. They are not as weak as your father believes, and more lives will be lost than just theirs. You must be prepared for what comes after." Ragnhild clenched her fists, frustrated. "What are you saying, mother? That I should let this go?" "No," Ingrid said, shaking her head. "But do not let rage blind you. If we go to war, you must lead, and you must be more than just a warrior. You must be a leader who understands when to strike and when to hold back." Ragnhild said nothing, but she knew her mother was right. The fire of vengeance that had been burning so hotly within her now felt tempered by the cold reality of what war would bring. Still, the anger remained, and it called for action. "I will do what I must," Ragnhild said finally. "But first, I need to sharpen my blade." Ragnhild's breath came in sharp bursts as she swung her sword, the blade slicing through the cold air with each strike. She stood alone in the training yard, her body moving through the familiar motions of combat. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. Every strike of her sword was an image of her brother's killer, faceless and cruel. She stopped for a moment, chest heaving, her sword held before her. She imagined the weight of the enemy's blade meeting hers, the clang of iron, the smell of blood and sweat. She had trained all her life for this, for battle, but now that it was upon her, the reality was much heavier than she had ever anticipated. Thorbjorn, her father's most trusted huskarl, approached from the shadows, his heavy footsteps crunching on the frost-covered earth. "You train hard, Ragnhild, but you train like someone who seeks only death." Ragnhild lowered her blade, glaring at him. "What else is there to seek?" Thorbjorn stopped a few paces away, his hand resting on the pommel of his own sword. "There is more to life than revenge. Your father, your clan, they need you to live, not die gloriously in battle. I will not rest until the Gunners pay for what they have done." Ragnhild shot back, her voice thick with emotion. Thorbjorn regarded her for a long moment, then sighed. "I see your father in you, but you are also your mother's daughter. Do not let anger cloud your judgment. The path ahead will be dark, and you must keep your wits about you if you are to survive." Ragnhild said nothing, but Thorbjorn's words lingered in her mind long after he left. She knew the path before her was one of blood and steel, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Later that night, as Ragnhild lay awake in her cold bed, she stared at the ceiling, the weight of the future pressing down on her. She would avenge Bjorn. She would see the Gunners destroyed. But at what cost? How many lives would be lost before the feud was over? How much of herself would she have to give? With a sigh, she closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, her dreams were filled with visions of fire, blood, and a shadowy figure on the battlefield, waiting for her. The longship cut through the icy waters of the fjord, its prow shaped like a snarling dragon's head. Ragnhild stood at the bow, her hand gripping the rough wood as the cold wind whipped her braids against her face. The sea spray stung her skin, but she welcomed the bite of it. It kept her focused, reminding her that her journey was one of necessity, not emotion. Ahead, the mountains loomed like silent gods, their snow-capped peaks piercing the gray sky. Nestled in the shadows of those mountains lay the stronghold of Jarl Eirik, a distant cousin, and a man known for his love of gold more than honor. Ragnhild's father, Ulf, had sent her to seek an alliance, one that would strengthen the Sverker clan for the war against the Gunners. But Ragnhild knew the cost of such an alliance. Ragnhild! A voice broke through the sound of the waves. Thorbjorn, her father's most trusted huskarl, came to stand beside her, his hulking figure towering over her. His beard was thick with frost, and his eyes were dark and serious as always. We will arrive by sundown. Have you thought of what you'll say to the Jarl? Ragnhild didn't answer immediately. She had thought of little else. She knew that words were as much a weapon as her sword, but they carried a different kind of weight. She could defeat an enemy in battle, but negotiating with men like Eric was a challenge of a different sort. I'll say what needs to be said, she replied finally, her voice steady but hard. Eric is no fool. He knows the gunners grow stronger with each passing season. He'll want to be on the side that wins. Thorbjorn grunted, his skepticism clear. Eric's loyalty is to his purse, not his kin. He'll ask for more than what you're willing to give. Ragnhild's jaw tightened. She knew Thorbjorn was right. Eric would demand a price for his support, and it would not be something easily given. Her independence, her freedom, perhaps even a marriage. But she had to think of her clan. With her father's health failing and her brother dead, the Sverker clan needed allies. War was coming, and she could not fight it alone. As the ship glided toward the shore, Ragnhild's thoughts drifted back to her brother. Bjorn had always been the one destined to lead their clan, the Golden Son, strong and fearless. Now, that mantle rested on her shoulders. It was a heavy burden, one she had never asked for, but one she would bear. I will not fail, she whispered to herself, more a promise than a statement. The hall of Jarl Eirik was a grand structure of timber and stone, its walls adorned with shields and tapestries that spoke of wealth and power. A fire roared in the central hearth, casting long shadows across the room as the warriors of Eirik's household feasted on meat and mead. Ragnhild entered with Thorbjorn at her side, her eyes scanning the room. Jarl Eirik sat at the head of the long table, a broad-shouldered man with a gold-trimmed cloak and a crown of silver atop his thinning hair. His face was smooth, almost too smooth for a man who claimed to be a warrior, and his eyes were sharp with calculation. Ragnhild Sverker, Eirik said, rising to his feet as she approached. His voice was slick, like oil on water, and a smile played at his lips. It's been many years since you've graced my hall. The last time I saw you, you were but a girl. Ragnhild dipped her head slightly in greeting, her expression cool. And the last time I saw you, Jarl Eirik, you were not yet weighed down by all this gold. She gestured subtly to his garb, drawing laughter from some of the warriors at the table. Eric's smile tightened, but he recovered quickly. Wealth comes to those who are wise enough to seize it, but I suspect you haven't come here to admire my riches. Come, sit. Let us talk of why you have sailed to my shores. Ragnhild took a seat, her body tense as she prepared for what was to come. The hall grew quiet as the warriors watched, knowing that the words exchanged here could shape the fate of many. Thorbjorn remained standing behind her, a silent sentinel. You know of the feud between my family and the Gunners, Ragnhild began, her voice firm but measured. Bjorn, my brother, was killed by them. His death demands retribution, but to fight the Gunners alone would be folly. They are strong, and their influence spreads like rot. My father Ulf is old and his strength fades. I come to you to ask for your aid in what is to come. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrests. Ah, the Gunners. Yes, I have heard of the troubles between your families. It's a sad business, truly. But war is costly. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. What would you offer in return for my support? Ragnhild expected this. She had prepared herself for his demands. Land, a portion of our southern pastures once the war is won, and a share of the spoils when we take the Gunner stronghold. Eric chuckled softly. Land and spoils, you say? Tempting. But I fear I require more. The Gunners are dangerous, yes, but so are many others who would covet my favor. I need assurance that our alliance will be permanent. Ragnhild's stomach twisted. She knew where this was headed, but she kept her expression neutral. A marriage, Eric continued, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Between you and my son, Hrolf. He is a fine warrior, and with your bloodlines united, our clans would be unbreakable. Ragnhild's eyes flickered with anger, but she kept it in check. Hrolf, Eirik's son, was a man she barely knew, a brute with more brawn than wit. The thought of binding herself to him turned her stomach, but she also knew what refusal could mean. Eirik would withhold his support, and the Sverkers would be left vulnerable. You would have me marry your son in exchange for your help? Ragnhild's voice was cold, her tone sharpened like a blade. Eirik's eyes gleamed. It is a small price for victory. You seek vengeance, and I offer you the means to achieve it. Ragnhild's mind raced. She could see Thorbjorn tense beside her, ready to step in if needed. But no sword could help her here. This was a battlefield of words, and she had to be cunning. If she agreed, she would be bound to a man she had no love for, and her freedom would be lost. If she refused, her clan would stand alone. I am no man's prize to be won, she said, her voice steady. But I will not insult you by dismissing your offer outright. Let me think on it. Eirik's smile faltered, but he nodded. Of course. Take your time, Ragnhild. But remember, the tides of war wait for no one. That night, Ragnhild stood outside the hall, looking out at the fjord. The cold wind stung her face, and her thoughts were as dark as the waters below. She had come here seeking strength, but now she felt more trapped than ever. A marriage to Hrolf would bind her to a man she did not respect, a man who would see her as nothing more than a pawn. Thorbjorn approached quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. What will you do? Ragnhild didn't answer right away. She stared out at the sea, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. I will not marry him, she said at last, her voice firm. I will find another way. Thorbjorn nodded, relief visible in his eyes. Your father will stand with you no matter what. Ragnhild turned to face him, her expression hardening. We will gather our allies. We will fight the gunners, with or without Eirik's help. I will not trade my freedom for a sword. Thorbjorn placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip strong and reassuring. Then we fight. And in the distance, the mountains stood like silent witnesses, watching as Ragnhild Sverker steeled herself for the war that was to come. The icy winds howled through the mountain pass as Ragnhild's longship cut through the choppy waves, steering toward the Thing, the assembly where jarls and chieftains of the northern fjords would meet to deliberate peace, war, and alliances. She stood at the prow, her heart as stormy as the sky above. The Thing would be the first chance for her to confront Håkon Gunnar since her brother's death. The thought of facing him filled her with both anger and dread. Her father, Ulf, had sent word to the other clans, calling for a resolution to the blood feud, but Ragnhild knew the truth. This was not a gathering for peace. It was a battlefield of words and alliances, where men sought power through manipulation as much as through steel. The gunners would be there, and so would the jarls who could tip the balance of the coming war. Thorbjorn stood at her side, his thick fur cloak shielding him from the biting wind. You're quiet, Ragnhild, he said, his voice gruff. What's on your mind? She glanced at him, her eyes dark with worry. I'm thinking of Bjorn. I'm thinking of what it will take to avenge him. Thorbjorn nodded, his face hard. We will have our vengeance. Håkon will pay for his treachery, but tread carefully at the Thing. The jarls are not to be trusted, and Håkon, he's clever. Ragnhild's grip tightened on the edge of the longship. Clever. That word stuck in her mind like a thorn. Håkon was many things, cunning, ruthless, but she had also heard whispers that he was different from the rest of his clan. Some said he sought peace, though Ragnhild doubted it. Bjorn's blood was on his hands, and no amount of words would wash that away. The Thing was held in the shadow of a great mountain, its snow-covered peak towering over the assembly like an ancient god. Hundreds of warriors, jarls, and free men gathered in the vast clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees in the frozen fjord. Fires burned in iron braziers, casting flickering light across the faces of those assembled. Ragnhild stood at her father's side as the Sverker clan took their place in the circle. Ulf looked weak, his illness more pronounced in the cold air. He had aged rapidly since Bjorn's death, his once powerful frame now gaunt and frail. But his spirit remained unbroken. He would not live to see the end of this war, Ragnhild knew, but he would fight for his son's honor until his last breath. As they waited for the meeting to begin, Ragnhild's gaze swept across the gathering, searching for the gunners. Her heart clenched when she saw them. Håkon stood tall and proud, his long, dark hair pulled back, his face expressionless. His warriors, fierce and scarred, flanked him like wolves guarding their alpha. He had the look of a man who had seen too many battles, but there was something unsettling about his calmness. It was as though the storm raging around them did not touch him. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Ragnhild felt her blood surge with anger, the urge to charge across the clearing and bury her sword in his chest nearly overwhelming her. But she held her ground, her jaw clenched, her fists tight. Håkon's expression didn't change. He simply held her gaze, as though waiting for her to make the first move. Ulf broke the tension by stepping forward, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. Brothers, jarls, free men, we gather today not to seek more blood, but to find justice. My son, Bjorn Sverker, was murdered in cold blood by the gunners. The time has come for this feud to be settled. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Håkon remained still. Ragnhild's eyes narrowed as she watched him. He was waiting, calculating. After a long pause, Håkon finally stepped forward. His voice was low but carried across the assembly with a quiet authority. It is true that there is blood between our clans, but I deny that Bjorn was murdered. It was an honorable death, in the heat of battle. Ragnhild's blood boiled at his words. An honorable death? Her brother had been ambushed, killed while he was alone and unarmed. There was no honor in that. She stepped forward before her father could speak, her voice sharp as a blade. Do not dare speak of honor, Håkon Gunnar. You hide behind falsehoods while my brother lies cold in the earth. Your clan has stained the Sverker name with betrayal, and I will see that blood repaid. Hakon's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, a flicker of something passed over his face. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. He took a step closer and the crowd parted, sensing the tension between them. You speak of betrayal, Ragnhild Sverker, but do you know the truth of what happened that day? Håkon's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Your brother was a warrior, and he died as warriors do. You demand vengeance, but do you even understand what that means? More death? More loss? Is that what you want? Ragnhild's heart pounded in her chest, anger and confusion swirling together. What I want is justice. Håkon shook his head slightly, a bitter smile on his lips. Justice is a word used by those who seek only more violence. Do you think your brother would want this war to continue? Ragnhild's hands tightened into fists. She could feel the eyes of the assembly on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Her mind raced. She had expected Håkon to deny everything, to meet her accusations with hostility. But this calmness, this attempt to reason with her, it threw her off balance. She looked to her father, whose eyes were burning with fury. Ulf would never accept anything less than total vengeance, and the warriors of her clan expected nothing less. But deep in her heart, Ragnhild felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. Before she could speak again, the sky above them rumbled, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The crowd shifted uneasily as the storm moved in, but Håkon held her gaze. Think carefully, Ragnhild, he said softly, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. This feud will destroy us both if it continues. You seek to avenge your brother's death, but how many more brothers will die before it ends? The words struck deep, like an arrow piercing her armor. She had sworn to avenge Bjorn, but Håkon's words stirred something in her, something she didn't want to admit. She had seen too many bodies burned on pyres, too many tears shed over the graves of fallen warriors, How much blood was enough? But then she saw Bjorn's face in her mind, remembered the feel of his hand on her shoulder, his laughter echoing in the hall. He had been her protector, her brother, and now he was gone. She couldn't let his death go unanswered. "We will meet again, Håkon," she said, her voice hard. "But it will not be in a hall of words. It will be on the battlefield." Håkon's expression didn't change, but there was a shadow of sadness in his eyes. He nodded once, and then turned away, walking back to his warriors. The storm broke fully then, the rain coming down in sheets as the thing disbanded. Ragnhild stood in the rain, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had expected fury, a fire that would drive her to the edge of war. But what she had found was something far more dangerous: doubt. Later that night, as the Sverker clan huddled in their tents, Ragnhild sat alone by the dying embers of a fire, the rain still pattering softly on the earth. Thorbjorn approached, sitting beside her with a grunt. "You spoke well today," he said, his voice low. "But I saw something in you when Håkon spoke. Doubt." Ragnhild didn't look at him. She stared into the flames, her face wet from both rain and tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "I don't know what I feel anymore, Thorbjorn. All I know is that Bjorn is gone, and no matter how many words we speak, it won't bring him back." Thorbjorn was silent for a long moment, then placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, Ragnhild. But remember this. No matter what path you choose, you will always have those who will stand with you." She nodded, grateful for his loyalty, but her heart still felt heavy. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and Ragnhild knew that the hardest battles were yet to come, not just with the gunners, but with herself. And in the darkness, the gods watched, as they always did, waiting to see what she would do next. The sound of hammers striking iron echoed through the Sverker village as Ragnhild strode toward the forge, her mind a storm of thoughts. Her father's hall had been filled with the clamor of warriors preparing for war ever since they returned from the Thing. The decision had been made. There would be no peace with the gunners. The whispers of doubt that Håkon had planted in her heart still gnawed at her, but they were drowned out by the louder call of vengeance. Her brother's death had to be avenged. There could be no other way. The heat of the forge greeted her as she approached, the scent of burning coals mixing with the cold mountain air. Inside, her father's blacksmith Eric stood over an anvil, hammering a new sword into shape. His face was covered in soot, and sweat dripped from his brow, despite the chill outside. Ragnhild waited until he paused to wipe his forehead before speaking. "I need you to sharpen my blade, Eric," she said, her voice flat but firm. "It must be ready for what's to come." Eric glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. I can sharpen it, but you look like you have other battles on your mind." Ragnhild frowned, stepping closer to the heat of the forge. "I do, but it matters little. This war is coming, whether I'm ready for it or not." The blacksmith placed his hammer down, wiping his hands on his apron. "Wars are won by more than sharp blades, Ragnhild. Your mind needs to be as sharp as your sword. You can't lead your people if you're divided inside." Ragnhild felt a flash of irritation at his words, but she bit it back. Eric had served her family for years, and his wisdom had always carried weight. But still, how could he understand? He hadn't stood before Håkon and felt that strange pull, that unsettling sense that there was more to this feud than simple hatred. "My mind is clear enough," she said, her voice tight. "The gunners killed my brother. They deserve to pay for what they've done." Eric nodded slowly. I know, and I'm not saying they don't, but vengeance can blind a person. Make sure you're not the one who gets cut down in the process." His words hung in the air like smoke from the forge as Ragnhild handed over her sword. Eric took it and examined the blade, running his fingers along the edge. "I'll have it ready by morning," he said, his voice quieter now. "Take care, Ragnhild. I've seen too many good warriors lost because they were too eager for revenge." She nodded once before turning and leaving the forge, her emotions swirling. The village was alive with preparations for war, but even amid the activity, Ragnhild felt a strange sense of isolation. Everyone around her seemed so certain, so focused. Her warriors, her family, they all expected her to lead them into battle, to avenge Bjorn's death without question. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from her, something she couldn't quite name. The moon hung low in the sky as Ragnhild made her way to the cliffs overlooking the fjord. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees. But she needed to be alone, away from the noise and the weight of expectation. The sea below crashed against the rocks, a constant reminder of the power and unpredictability of the world around her. She stood at the edge of the cliff, her cloak billowing behind her in the wind. Her mind returned, as it so often did these days, to Bjorn. She could still see his face, still hear his laugh. He had been everything to her, a protector, a guide, the brother who had always stood between her and the dangers of the world. And now he was gone, stolen from her by the gunner's treachery. "Bjorn," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. "What would you have me do?" The question echoed in her mind, but no answer came. Only the roar of the sea below and the cold bite of the night air. She closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Could she really lead her people into a war that would likely cost them so much? Could she bear the burden of being the last of her family, the one who must carry the Sverker name through the storm of bloodshed that was coming? The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn sharply, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife at her belt. But when she saw Astrid standing there, her friend wrapped tightly in a fur cloak, Ragnhild relaxed. "I didn't mean to startle you," Astrid said, her voice soft as she approached. "I've been looking for you." Ragnhild forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You found me." Astrid stepped closer, her gaze searching Ragnhild's face. "You've been distant ever since the thing. Something's troubling you." Ragnhild sighed, turning back to look at the sea. "Everything troubles me, Astrid. This war, my father's health, the weight of leading our clan. It's more than I ever thought it would be." "I know it's hard," Astrid said, her voice gentle. "But you're strong, Ragnhild. You've always been strong." "I don't feel strong," Ragnhild admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I feel lost. I want to avenge Bjorn. I want to see the gunners pay. But I stood before Hakon at the thing, and he didn't seem like a man who wanted war. He spoke of peace. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought..." Astrid's expression hardened. "Hakon is a liar, Ragnhild. He's trying to weaken you, make you doubt yourself. That's what men like him do. They twist the truth until you don't know what's real anymore." Ragnhild shook her head, frustration bubbling up inside her. "I know that, but what if he's right? What if this feud only brings more death? Bjorn is gone, but how many more will die if we keep fighting?" Astrid's eyes flashed with anger. "You can't think like that. Your brother's death demands justice. The gunners are our enemies, and they'll never stop until we're destroyed. You're the only one who can lead us through this." Ragnhild met Astrid's gaze, seeing the fierce loyalty in her friend's eyes. Astrid had always been the one pushing her forward, always the one who believed in her when Ragnhild doubted herself. But tonight, that faith felt like another burden. "I just don't know if I can do it," Ragnhild whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You can," Astrid insisted, stepping closer and gripping her arm. "And you will. The clan needs you, Ragnhild. We all need you." Ragnhild closed her eyes, the weight of Astrid's words pressing down on her. She wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that she was strong enough to lead her people into battle, to avenge her brother's death. But deep down, the doubts lingered, like shadows that refused to be banished. "I'll try," she said finally, her voice heavy with uncertainty. "I'll try." The next morning, Ragnhild stood in the village square watching as her warriors gathered for the journey ahead. Eric had sharpened her blade, and now it gleamed in the cold winter sunlight, as ready for battle as she was. Her father, Ulf, stood beside her, leaning heavily on his staff. His face was pale and his breath came in labored gasps, but his eyes were filled with pride as he looked at her. "You will lead them, Ragnhild," Ulf said, his voice a whisper. "You will carry our family's honor into battle." Ragnhild nodded, her heart aching. She knew what this meant. Her father would not live to see the end of this war. His time was running out, and with his death, the full weight of leadership would fall on her shoulders. "I will not fail," she promised, though inside the doubts still churned. As the longships prepared to set sail, Ragnhild took one last look at the village, at the home she might never see again. The path ahead was filled with blood and steel, and she would have to walk it no matter where it led. With a deep breath, she stepped onto the longship, her sword at her side, and the sails filled with the wind. The air was thick with the scent of salt and pine as Ragnhild's fleet of longships glided through the narrow fjord, the oars cutting through the water with rhythmic precision. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a red glow over the mountains, as if the gods themselves were foreshadowing the blood that would soon be spilled. At the front of her ship, Ragnhild gripped the hilt of her sword, her knuckles white as she stared at the distant shore where the Gunnar stronghold loomed like a beast waiting in the shadows. Beside her, Thorbjorn leaned on his axe, his face grim but steady. "We'll reach their shores before nightfall," he said, breaking the silence. "Are you ready?" Ragnhild turned to him, her expression hard. "Ready?" she echoed, her voice tight with a mix of resolve and doubt. "I've been ready since the day they killed Bjorn, but whether my sword is sharp enough or my heart strong enough, I don't know." Thorbjorn studied her for a moment, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are strong, Ragnhild. Stronger than any man in our clan. You've led us this far, and we follow you because we believe in you. Don't doubt yourself now, not when the battle is so close." She nodded, though inside, the storm of uncertainty still raged. She had made the choice to lead her people into war, but the cost of that decision weighed heavily on her. How many of her warriors would fall before the dawn? How much more blood would be spilled in the name of vengeance? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low cry from the watchman. "The Gunnar stronghold. It's in sight." Ragnhild's heart quickened as she turned to look. There, at the end of the fjord, the Gunnar hall stood atop a rocky hill, its wooden walls reinforced with stone surrounded by steep cliffs on three sides. A fortress built for defense, its watchtowers dark and foreboding. Torches flickered along the walls, and the faint sound of horns echoed through the air as the gunners prepared for their arrival. "We'll need to move quickly," Thorbjorn said, his eyes scanning the shore. "They'll be ready for us. A frontal assault on the walls could be costly." Ragnhild nodded, her mind racing. "We'll use the cover of night," she said, her voice firm. "We'll land the ships on the far side of the fjord and move through the forest. If we can get close enough before they spot us, we might be able to breach their walls before they're fully prepared." Thorbjorn grinned, a flash of savage anticipation in his eyes. "A good plan. The gunners won't know what hit them." But Ragnhild felt no satisfaction in the plan, only a cold, calculated determination. This wasn't a raid for glory. It was a fight for survival, for justice, for Bjorn. The moon was high in the sky by the time Ragnhild and her warriors reached the edge of the forest, their forms hidden in the shadows as they moved silently through the trees. Ahead, the walls of the Gunnar stronghold rose high, the stone glistening with frost in the moonlight. The sound of distant voices carried on the wind, but the gunners had yet to notice the Sverker warband creeping toward their gates. Ragnhild signaled for her warriors to halt as they reached the base of the hill. She crouched low beside Thorbjorn, her breath visible in the cold night air. "We strike hard and fast," she whispered. "Once we breach the walls, we push to the hall. Håkon Gunnar will be inside. He's the one we want." Thorbjorn nodded, his eyes gleaming with the promise of battle. I'll lead the first wave. We'll draw their attention while you and the others scale the walls. Ragnhild clasped his forearm, the gesture both one of respect and silent gratitude. Stay alive, old friend. I'll need you on the other side of this. He grinned, a flash of teeth in the darkness. I've fought through worse than this. We'll drink together in the hall of our ancestors when this is done. With that, Thorbjorn rose, signaling to the first group of warriors to follow him. Ragnhild watched as they slipped through the trees, their forms soon disappearing into the night. Moments later, the sound of shouting broke the stillness as Thorbjorn's group launched their attack on the main gate. The clash of steel ringing through the air as the gunners rushed to defend their walls. Ragnhild didn't hesitate. She signaled for her group to move forward, leading them toward a section of the wall where the stones had begun to crumble with age. They moved swiftly, scaling the wall with the aid of ropes and grappling hooks, the cold stone biting at their hands as they climbed. As she reached the top, Ragnhild peered over the edge, her heart pounding. A few gunner guards were stationed along the wall, their attention focused on the gate where Thorbjorn's group was making their assault. Ragnhild motioned to her warriors, and they moved as one, leaping over the wall and cutting down the guards before they could raise the alarm. The path to the hall was clear. Inside the gunner hall, the fire in the central hearth crackled, casting long shadows across the wooden beams. Håkon Gunnar stood in the center of the room, his sword drawn, his face calm but alert as the sounds of battle echoed from outside. Around him his warriors waited, their faces hard, ready to defend their leader. The doors burst open, and Ragnhild strode into the hall, her sword gleaming in the firelight. Blood stained her tunic, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "Håkon Gunnar," she called, her voice steady despite the fury that roiled within her. "The time has come for you to answer for what you've done." Hakon's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. He looked different from when she had seen him at the Thing. There was no trace of the calm negotiator now. This was the warrior, the man who had led raids and cut down his enemies with brutal efficiency. "I warned you, Ragnhild," Hakon said, his voice low but strong. "This feud will destroy us both." "Bjorn is dead," Ragnhild spat, stepping closer, her sword raised. "Your family took him from me, and now I've come to take everything from you." Hakon's gaze didn't waver. "Bjorn's death was not my doing. He died as any warrior would, in battle." "Lies," Ragnhild snarled. "He was ambushed, unarmed, and alone. There was no battle." Hakon's face darkened, a shadow of guilt passing over him. "There are things you don't know, Ragnhild. Things about your brother, about why he was killed. But if it's vengeance you want, then take it." With that, Håkon raised his sword, and the two warriors circled each other in the hall, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The first clash of their swords rang through the hall like thunder, the force of the blow sending sparks into the air. Ragnhild's movements were swift and precise, fueled by anger and grief, but Håkon was a seasoned fighter, and his strikes were controlled, measured. "You think killing me will end this?" Håkon grunted as their blades locked. "More blood will only bring more death." "I don't care," Ragnhild hissed, pushing him back with a surge of strength. "I will see your family fall just as mine has." They fought fiercely, each strike filled with the weight of their history, their hatred. But as the battle wore on, Ragnhild began to see something in Håkon's eyes, something that unsettled her. He wasn't fighting for his life. He wasn't afraid to die. In a moment of hesitation, Håkon's blade slipped past her defenses, slicing her arm. She stumbled back, pain searing through her, but she gritted her teeth and raised her sword again. Håkon lowered his blade, his chest heaving with effort. "Enough," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is not the way." Ragnhild's heart pounded in her ears, her vision blurred with exhaustion and rage. You don't get to decide that." Håkon's gaze softened, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "If you kill me now, the blood feud will never end. My people will hunt you down and the cycle will continue. But if we stop now, if we choose peace, it doesn't have to be this way. Ragnhild stood there, her chest heaving, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Could she do it? Could she end the feud without more death? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but deep down, she knew the truth. With a shaking hand, she lowered her sword. The morning sun rose slowly over the fjord, casting a pale light over the Sverker camp. The air was thick with the aftermath of battle, scorched earth, the scent of blood, and the heavy silence that followed the storm of violence. Ragnhild sat on a rock by the shore, staring out at the sea, her sword resting across her lap, her mind filled with the weight of what had just transpired in the Gunnar Hall. She had spared Håkon Gunnar's life. Her people had expected blood. Her father had demanded vengeance. Yet when the moment had come, something inside her had shifted. A feeling she couldn't explain, but that had made her hand falter. She had wanted to bury her sword in Håkon's chest, to feel the satisfaction of avenging her brother's death. But when she looked into Håkon's eyes, she had seen something different, something that had given her pause. Mercy. Ragnhild had never thought herself capable of it, yet here she was, wrestling with the consequences of that decision. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Thorbjorn. His heavy presence was as familiar as her own heartbeat, a constant companion in the chaos of her life. He sat down beside her without a word, his face as grim as ever. "I heard what happened in the hall," Thorbjorn said after a long silence. His voice was quiet but laced with unspoken questions. Ragnhild didn't look at him. "I spared him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had him on his knees, and I didn't strike the final blow." Thorbjorn was silent for a moment, then let out a long breath. "You did what you thought was right." Ragnhild finally turned to him, her face etched with frustration and doubt. "Was it right, Thorbjorn? Or was it weakness? My father wanted Håkon dead. The clan expects vengeance, and I couldn't do it." Thorbjorn's gaze was steady, his expression thoughtful. "Vengeance is a powerful thing, Ragnhild. It can drive men to do great things, but it can also destroy them. You had the strength to stop, to see another way. That's not weakness. That's leadership." "Leadership," Ragnhild repeated bitterly. "My people don't want a leader who hesitates. They want blood for blood. How can I lead them when I've already betrayed that?" Thorbjorn placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You didn't betray them. You made a choice. And now you have to live with it. But that doesn't mean you've lost your strength. It means you've gained something else. Perspective. Wisdom." Ragnhild shook her head, frustration boiling inside her. "Wisdom won't stop the Gunnars from retaliating. They'll see my mercy as weakness. We've gained nothing from this except more uncertainty." Thorbjorn's expression softened, a rare occurrence for the hardened warrior. "Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with swords. Sometimes the hardest battle is within ourselves." Ragnhild fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always believed strength came from the sword, from the ability to fight and conquer. But now she was beginning to understand that true strength was something far more complex, something that required her to think beyond the immediacy of bloodshed. But even with that understanding, she felt lost. How could she lead her people if they no longer trusted her? If they saw her mercy as a betrayal of the very values that had held the Sverker clan together for generations? As if sensing her inner turmoil, Thorbjorn stood and looked out over the camp. "The men are waiting, Ragnhild. They need to hear from you. If you don't stand before them, they'll assume the worst. It's time to speak as their leader, not just as a warrior." Ragnhild looked up at him, her stomach tightening with anxiety. "What can I say? That I spared the man who killed my brother? That I've doomed us to more conflict?" Thorbjorn's eyes were steady. "Tell them the truth. The truth is all a leader can give." Ragnhild stood before her warriors later that morning, her heart pounding in her chest. The camp was silent, the faces of her men and women hard with expectation. She saw her mother, Ingrid, standing at the edge of the gathering, her face unreadable. Astrid was nearby, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Even her father, Ulf, pale and frail from his illness, sat with a blanket draped over his shoulders, his eyes burning with the need for vengeance. They were all waiting for her to speak. Ragnhild took a deep breath, feeling the cold air sting her lungs. She had faced many battles in her life, but this moment, standing before her people with the weight of her decision pressing down on her, felt like the hardest battle of all. "I know what you expected," she began, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. "You expected me to bring you the head of Håkon Gunnar. You expected me to avenge my brother's death with blood, but that's not what happened." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and she saw several of her warriors shift uneasily. Her father's face tightened and Ingrid's gaze sharpened, but Ragnhild pressed on. "I stood before Håkon with my sword at his throat. I could have killed him, and I wanted to, but I didn't." The murmur grew louder, disbelief and frustration spreading like wildfire. Astrid stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "You spared him?" she spat. "After all we've lost? After Bjorn? After everything?" Ragnhild met her gaze, her own anger rising. "Yes, I spared him. Not because I didn't want vengeance, not because I didn't want to honor Bjorn, but because I saw something in Håkon that made me realize that more blood won't solve this. It will only continue the cycle of violence." Her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Astrid took another step forward, her face twisted with rage. "You call it mercy, but I call it weakness. The Gunnars have taken everything from us, and you would let them live to strike at us again? Where is your honor, Ragnhild?" Ragnhild's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Honor isn't just about killing. It's about making decisions that will protect our people in the long run. If I had killed Håkon, his people would have sought revenge, and we would have been dragged into a war that would destroy us all. I chose to end the feud." Ulf, her father, coughed harshly from his seat, his voice weak but cutting through the tension like a knife. "You chose to dishonor our family's name." Ragnhild's heart sank as she met her father's eyes. The disappointment in them was a dagger to her soul. "Father, I didn't dishonor our name. I protected it. If we continue this feud, there will be no Sverker clan left to honor." Ulf's hand shook as he pointed at her. "You've betrayed your brother. You've betrayed me." The words struck her like a blow, and for a moment, Ragnhild's resolve wavered. But then she felt Thorbjorn's presence at her side, steady and unyielding, and she remembered what he had told her earlier. Leadership wasn't just about strength. It was about making choices that others couldn't or wouldn't make. She straightened her shoulders and faced the crowd, her voice rising with conviction. "I know many of you think I've failed you. I know you wanted blood for blood. But I ask you to trust me. We have lost too much already, and if we continue down this path, we will lose everything. I did what I thought was right, for all of us." For a long moment there was only silence, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the distant crash of the waves against the shore. The faces before her were hard, filled with doubt and anger. But Ragnhild held her ground, her heart pounding as she waited for their judgment. Then slowly, Thorbjorn stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Ragnhild is our leader. She made a choice in battle, a hard choice. But I stand with her." One by one, a few others nodded their agreement, though many still looked uncertain. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. As the crowd began to disperse, Ragnhild felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders like a cloak of iron. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The wind howled across the frozen landscape, carrying with it the promise of a long, brutal winter. The Sverker camp, nestled in the shadow of the mountains, was alive with the sounds of men and women sharpening their blades, repairing their armor, and preparing for the inevitable battle to come. Though Ragnhild had spared Håkon Gunnar's life, she knew that peace was a fleeting hope. War still loomed on the horizon, and the wolves of the north were gathering. Ragnhild stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the snow-covered plains. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the difficult choices that lay ahead. She had tried to break the cycle of bloodshed, but the threads of vengeance were woven too deeply into the fabric of their world. The gunners would strike back eventually, if not Hakon, then someone else from his clan, someone with less restraint and more thirst for blood. She heard footsteps approaching from behind, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. Thorbjorn had been her shadow for days, ever since the confrontation with her father and Astrid. He had stood by her, even when others questioned her decisions. "You look troubled," Thorbjorn said, his voice a low rumble as he came to stand beside her. Ragnhild didn't answer right away. She stared out at the horizon, where the dark clouds gathered like a forewarning. "I spared Hakon's life to end the feud," she said quietly, "but I fear it hasn't ended anything." Thorbjorn grunted, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Feuds like this don't end so easily, Ragnhild. You know that as well as I do. But you made a choice. A hard choice. You showed mercy where others would have shown none. That's what makes you a better leader." Ragnhild turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really believe that? Do you believe this mercy will protect our people when the gunners come for us again?" Thorbjorn's expression was unreadable for a moment, but then he sighed. "I don't know. What I do know is that you've bought us time. Time to gather our strength, time to prepare, and when the time comes, we'll be ready." Ragnhild nodded, but her heart still felt heavy with the weight of her decisions. Every day, the tension in the camp grew. Her warriors were eager for action, their frustration simmering beneath the surface. And then there was Astrid, who had grown colder and more distant since the day Ragnhild had spared Hakon. She had once been Ragnhild's closest friend, but now there was a rift between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Later that evening, as the camp settled into a tense quiet, Ragnhild found herself sitting by the fire with her father, Ulf. His illness had worsened since their return from the battle, and he now sat wrapped in furs, his once powerful frame reduced to frailty. His eyes, though dimmed with age and sickness, still burned with the same intensity that had made him a feared and respected leader. "Father," Ragnhild began hesitantly, "I need your counsel." Ulf's eyes flickered toward her, his expression weary but attentive. "You seek the advice of an old man who can barely hold his sword?" His voice was raspy, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "I seek the advice of my father," she said softly, meeting his gaze. Ulf's smile faded, and he looked into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. "You've done something I never could," he said quietly. "You showed mercy to an enemy. But mercy in this world is dangerous, Ragnhild. It can be seen as weakness, and weakness invites attack." Ragnhild's heart clenched at his words. She had feared this response from him, but it still hurt to hear it spoken aloud. "So, you think I was wrong?" Ulf's gaze shifted back to her, his expression unreadable. "I think you followed your heart, and in that, you were not wrong. But following your heart and leading a clan are two different things. The gunners are wolves, and wolves never forget the scent of blood. They'll come for you eventually." Ragnhild swallowed hard. "And when they do?" Ulf's face hardened. "When they do, you'll need to be ready to fight. But fight smart, not just with fury. You can't lead with your heart in war. You must be cold, calculating." The words were harsh, but Ragnhild understood them. She had seen enough battles to know that emotions could cloud judgment. But still, a part of her longed to believe that there was more to life than just endless fighting, that there could be something beyond the cycle of vengeance. "I understand," she said quietly. "But I don't know if I can be that kind of leader." Ulf's gaze softened, and for a moment, she saw the father who had always been her guide, the man who had taught her how to fight, how to lead. You can be whatever kind of leader you choose to be, Ragnhild. But the choice is yours alone. Ragnhild stood slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. Thank you, Father. The next morning, the camp was stirred by the sound of horns. Ragnhild emerged from her tent, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her sword. Warriors were already gathering in the clearing, their faces tense, as a group of riders appeared on the horizon, their banners flapping in the cold wind. It's them, Thorbjorn muttered beside her. The gunners. Ragnhild's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this, but not so soon. As the riders approached, she recognized Hakon Gunnar at the head of the group, his black cloak billowing behind him like the shadow of death. His face was grim, but not hostile, at least, not yet. Ragnhild stepped forward, her warriors close behind, as Hakon and his men rode into the camp. The tension was palpable, every eye watching, every hand ready to draw a weapon. Hakon dismounted, his gaze meeting Ragnhild's. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of their unspoken history hanging between them like a sword on a fraying thread. I've come to speak, Hakon said finally, his voice steady but guarded. Not to fight. Ragnhild raised an eyebrow, her fingers still resting on her sword. Why should I believe you? Hakon's expression darkened. Because if I wanted war, I wouldn't have come with just a handful of men. I came because I know what's coming, and I believe you do too. Ragnhild's heart quickened. What do you mean? Hakon glanced around at the Sverker warriors, his voice lowering. There's a storm brewing in the north. Sigurd the Wolf is rallying the other clans. He's using our feud to fuel his own ambitions, and he'll strike at both of us if we're not united. Ragnhild's mind raced. Sigurd the Wolf was a name she had heard before, an ambitious and ruthless chieftain who had been stirring unrest among the northern clans for years. If what Hakon said was true, then this was no longer just a feud between their families. This was something far more dangerous. You expect me to trust you after everything that's happened? Ragnhild asked, her voice sharp. Hakon's gaze was steady, his jaw clenched. No, I don't expect trust, but I expect you to see reason. Sigurd will destroy us both if we don't stand together. The camp was silent, every eye fixed on Ragnhild as she considered his words. This was the moment of decision, the moment where everything would either spiral into further bloodshed or find some fragile path to survival. She had spared Hakon's life once, hoping to end the cycle of violence. Now, he stood before her, offering a chance at something different, something that could either save them or doom them all. Ragnhild's grip tightened on her sword, her heart pounding. Could she risk trusting him again? Could she unite with the man who had once been her sworn enemy? She met Hakon's gaze, and in that moment, she made her decision. We will talk, she said, her voice steady. But make no mistake, Hakon. If this is a trap, I will not hesitate to end your life. Hakon nodded, his expression unreadable. Understood. As they turned and walked toward the fire at the center of the camp, Ragnhild felt the weight of leadership press down on her like never before. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and doubt. But she would walk it, no matter the cost. The storm clouds gathered thick and dark over the fjord, casting an ominous shadow over the land. The scent of rain mixed with the tang of iron and ash from the days of preparation. In the Sverker camp, the tension was palpable. Warriors sharpened their blades, checked their armor, and murmured prayers to the gods. Ragnhild stood at the heart of it all, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the forces of Sigurd the Wolf were said to be gathering. She had agreed to an alliance with Hakon Gunnar, an alliance that was as fragile as the first thin layer of ice on the fjord. It was a gamble, a chance to end not just her own feud but also the larger threat posed by Sigurd. But even now, as she stood ready for battle, doubt gnawed at her. Could she trust Hakon? Or would his people turn on her at the first opportunity? The sound of heavy footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Thorbjorn approached, his face grim, He had always been her rock, steady and unshakable, but even he seemed troubled by the coming storm. "They're moving," Thorbjorn said, his voice low but urgent. "Our scouts report that Sigurd's forces are marching from the north. They'll reach the pass by dusk." Ragnhild clenched her fists, her heart pounding with both anticipation and fear. "And Hakon? Has he sent any word?" Thorbjorn shook his head. "Nothing yet. But we have to assume they'll meet us at the pass, as agreed." Ragnhild's jaw tightened. The plan was simple. Her warriors would hold the pass, where the cliffs and narrow paths would give them the advantage against Sigurd's larger force. Meanwhile, Hakon's men would flank Sigurd from the west, trapping him between them. But if Hakon betrayed her, or simply failed to arrive, Ragnhild's forces would be overwhelmed. She turned to face her warriors, who had gathered around her, waiting for her command. They were tough, battle-hardened men and women, their faces scarred by countless raids and wars. But even they looked uneasy as they prepared for the fight to come. "Prepare for battle," Ragnhild called, her voice carrying over the camp. "We march for the pass within the hour." The pass was a narrow, rocky path between two towering cliffs, where only a few warriors could fight side by side. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Ragnhild had chosen it for that very reason. If they could hold here, they could funnel Sigurd's forces into a bottleneck, where their numbers would count for little. But as she stood at the entrance to the pass, watching her warriors take their positions, a cold dread settled in her stomach. The sky had grown darker, the storm looming closer, and still, there was no sign of Hakon. Thorbjorn stood beside her, his face as unreadable as ever. "He'll come," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "He knows what's at stake." Ragnhild wasn't so sure. Does he? Or does he see this as his chance to rid himself of both Sigurd and us? Before Thorbjorn could respond, a horn echoed across the valley, followed by the distant sound of war drums. Sigurd's forces were approaching. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and soon the first of Sigurd's warriors appeared on the ridge above, their shields gleaming in the fading light. Ragnhild felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The moment when all her decisions would come to fruition, for good or ill. She raised her sword, signaling her warriors to hold their ground. "Remember," she called to them, her voice clear and strong. "This pass is our shield. Do not let them break through. Fight for your families, for your brothers and sisters, for those who cannot fight for themselves. Fight with honor." Her warriors answered with a fierce battle cry, their shields locking together as they braced for the coming onslaught. Sigurd's forces descended upon them like a wave, crashing against the Sverker shield wall with the force of a storm. The clash of steel on steel filled the air, mingling with the shouts and screams of battle. Ragnhild fought at the front, her sword flashing as she parried blows and struck down her enemies. The first wave of attackers was repelled, but more followed, relentless and fierce. Amidst the chaos, Ragnhild caught a glimpse of Sigurd himself, towering over his warriors like a beast of legend. His helmet was adorned with wolf fangs, and his eyes burned with the cold fire of a man who had known nothing but war. He cut through her warriors with brutal efficiency, his axe cleaving through shields and armor as if they were made of paper. Ragnhild gritted her teeth and fought her way toward him, knowing that if Sigurd fell, his forces would crumble. But he was surrounded by his fiercest warriors, and for every step she took, another enemy blocked her path. "Sigurd!" she shouted, her voice rising above the din of battle. "Face me, coward!" Sigurd turned, his eyes locking onto her. He smiled, a cruel, mocking grin, and raised his axe in challenge. But before he could respond, a new sound cut through the battle, the blast of another horn from the west. Ragnhild's heart leapt as she saw them, Hakon's warriors descending from the cliffs like avenging spirits. They crashed into Sigurd's flank, throwing his forces into disarray. Hakon himself led the charge, his sword gleaming in the storm's half-light as he cut down Sigurd's men with ruthless precision. For a moment, Ragnhild couldn't believe it. Hakon had come. He hadn't betrayed her. With renewed strength, she pressed forward, her warriors rallying to her side as they surged against Sigurd's now splintered lines. The battle was turning in their favor, but Sigurd was not a man to be easily defeated. He fought like a cornered wolf, his rage growing with each enemy he felled. Ragnhild finally broke through the chaos and stood face to face with Sigurd. His eyes were wild with fury, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think you can end me, little girl?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "I am the wolf. The North bends to me." Ragnhild's grip tightened on her sword. "The North bends to no one," she replied coldly. "And neither will I." Sigurd roared and swung his axe with terrifying force, but Ragnhild was quicker. She sidestepped the blow and slashed her sword across his arm, drawing blood. He growled in pain but did not falter. They circled each other, the storm raging around them, as if the very gods were watching. "Your brother was weak," Sigurd taunted, his voice full of venom. "He begged for his life before we cut him down." Ragnhild's vision blurred with fury, but she didn't let his words shake her. "You're the only one who will beg today," she hissed, lunging at him. Their blades clashed again and again, each strike sending jolts of pain through her arms. Sigurd was strong, impossibly strong, but Ragnhild was faster, and with every strike, she wore him down. Finally, she saw her opening. As Sigurd raised his axe for another swing, Ragnhild darted inside his guard and drove her sword into his side. Sigurd's eyes widened in shock, his grip faltering as the blood poured from the wound. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the fire in his eyes dimming. Ragnhild stood over him, her chest heaving, her sword still clenched in her hand. "You may be the wolf," she said, her voice low but steady. "But today, the wolf dies." With a swift motion, she brought her sword down, ending Sigurd's life. The battlefield grew quiet as the last of Sigurd's forces fled into the mountains, leaderless and broken. Ragnhild stood in the center of it all, the weight of the battle finally settling on her shoulders. She had won. Sigurd was dead, and the threat he posed had been vanquished. But as she looked around at the fallen, both her own and her enemies, she felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. So much death. So much blood. Håkon approached, his sword still dripping with the blood of Sigurd's men. For a moment they stood in silence, neither knowing quite what to say. "You came," Ragnhild said at last, her voice hoarse. Håkon nodded, his expression grim. "We both had something to fight for." Ragnhild looked down at the body of Sigurd, her heart heavy. "It's over," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "But at what cost?" Håkon met her gaze, his eyes full of the same weariness she felt. "That's a question only the gods can answer." And as the storm finally broke, the rain washing the blood from the earth, Ragnhild could only hope the gods were watching, and that they would find some measure of peace in the wake of so much destruction. The rain fell softly on the ashes of the battlefield, a quiet counterpoint to the carnage that had taken place mere hours ago. The blood of the slain mixed with the soil, turning it into a muddy crimson mire. Ragnhild stood at the edge of the field, watching her warriors gather the bodies of their fallen. There was no triumph in her heart, only a heavy weight of sorrow. Sigurd the wolf was dead, but the cost of victory was etched into every weary face, every body laid upon the makeshift pyres. The Sverker clan had won, but they had bled for it. Her chest still ached from the battle, the adrenaline long since drained from her veins. She could feel the bruises from where Sigurd's axe had glanced off her shield, and her arm throbbed where his blade had cut her. But the pain of the body was nothing compared to the ache in her soul. Too many of her people had fallen for this fragile victory. Thorbjorn approached, his steps heavy with exhaustion. His face was streaked with blood, some of it his own, but most of it belonged to the enemies he had slain. He stopped beside her, staring out at the field, his broad shoulders sagging. "They fought well," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Sigurd's men were fierce, but our warriors held. They deserve to be remembered." Ragnhild nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "They will be," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Every one of them. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the crackling of the pyres and the soft murmur of the wind. The sky was still heavy with rain, as if the gods themselves were weeping for the dead. Thorbjorn turned to her, his brow furrowing with concern. "And what now, Ragnhild? Sigurd is dead, but the world hasn't stopped turning. The other clans, they'll be watching. Waiting." Ragnhild drew a slow breath, the weight of leadership pressing down on her like never before. "I know. The feud with the Gunnars hasn't ended, and there are those who will see Sigurd's death as an opportunity to seize power." Thorbjorn grunted in agreement. "It won't be long before others try to fill the void Sigurd left behind. Men like him always attract more wolves." The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. The North was full of ambition, and men like Sigurd were never truly alone in their hunger for power. Though she had won the battle, Ragnhild knew that peace would be fleeting, if it came at all. Later that evening, as the pyres burned in the Sverker camp, Ragnhild found herself standing in front of her father's tent. Ulf Sverker had grown weaker in the days since the battle, his illness worsening with every passing moment. The victory over Sigurd should have been a moment of pride for him, but there was no celebration left in his frail body. Ragnhild hesitated for a moment, then pushed aside the heavy fur curtain and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke from the small fire that burned in the center of the room. Her father lay on a bed of furs, his once powerful frame now withered and gaunt. His eyes, though, still burned, with the fierce intensity of a man who had seen too many battles and lived through more wars than any one person should have. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sharpening as he recognized her. "Ragnhild," he rasped, his voice thin and strained. "Is it done?" Ragnhild knelt beside him, her heart heavy. "It's done," she said quietly. "Sigurd is dead. His forces have been scattered. We've won." Ulf's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "And yet you don't look like a woman who's won." Ragnhild swallowed hard, the truth rising like a bitter taste in her throat. "There is no joy in this victory, father. Too many have died. And now, I fear the peace we fought for may not last." Ulf coughed, a deep, painful sound that rattled his frail chest. "Peace? Peace is a fleeting thing, Ragnhild. It's an illusion, bought with blood and held by those strong enough to wield it. But it never lasts, not in this world." Ragnhild clenched her fists, her knuckles white. Then what was it all for? What did Bjorn die for? What did our people die for? Her father's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, there was something like regret in his eyes. "They died for honor, for the survival of our clan. That is all. The gods give us life, but it is not ours to keep. It's only borrowed, and in the end, we must pay the price for it." Tears stung the corners of Ragnhild's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to show weakness. "I wanted more than that. I wanted to break the cycle of blood. I thought by sparing Hakon, we could have peace." Ulf's gaze grew distant as if he were seeing something beyond the tent, beyond the mortal realm. "You're a better leader than I ever was," he said softly. "I would have taken his head and been done with it. But your heart's in a different place." Ragnhild shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's to come." Her father reached out, his hand trembling, and took hers. His grip was weak, but the gesture was filled with the last of his strength. "You are, Ragnhild. You're stronger than you know. You will lead this clan through the storm, just as you led them today. I may not be here to see it, but I know you'll carry the Sverker name forward." Ragnhild bowed her head, her heart breaking under the weight of his words. She had always looked to her father for strength, for guidance. But now, in the twilight of his life, he was passing that burden to her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to bear it. "Rest now, father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll take care of everything." Ulf closed his eyes, his breath slowing, as if her words had given him permission to let go. "Take care of our people," he murmured, his voice fading like the last flicker of a dying fire. "Take care of yourself." Ragnhild sat with him for a long time, her hand still in his, as the fire in the center of the room crackled softly. The night deepened, and the rain outside drummed against the tent, a reminder that the world continued on, even as lives came to their end. The next day the air was thick with mourning as the pyre was prepared for Ulf Sverker. Ragnhild stood before the assembled warriors, her face a mask of calm even as her heart ached. Her father had passed in the night, leaving her to carry the mantle of leadership alone. Thorbjorn stood beside her as always, his presence a source of silent support. "He was a great man," Thorbjorn said quietly. "He would be proud of you." Ragnhild didn't respond right away. She watched as the flames consumed her father's body, the smoke rising to the sky in thick, dark columns. The warriors around her raised their voices in a solemn chant, honoring the man who had led them through so many battles, so many winters. But Ragnhild's mind was far away, lost in thoughts of the future. She had won the battle against Sigurd, but the war for peace was far from over. There were still enemies out there, still those who would see the Sverker clan fall. And now, without her father's guidance, the weight of that responsibility rested solely on her shoulders. As the flames climbed higher, Ragnhild made a silent vow. She would honor her father's memory by leading her people with strength and wisdom. She would protect them, no matter the cost. And she would find a way to break the cycle of bloodshed, even if it meant forging a new path, one that had never been walked before. The gods watched from the heavens and the wolves of the north howled in the distance, but Ragnhild stood firm, her heart steeled for the battles to come. This was her clan now, her future, her burden, and she would carry it. As the pyre burned down to embers, Ragnhild turned away, her face set with grim determination. The wind carried the last of her father's ashes into the sky, and with them, the last of her doubts. The road ahead was dark, but she would walk it without fear. For the Sverkers, for her father, for herself. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting a pale glow across the land. The fires in the Sverker camp had burned low through the night, their embers glowing like dying stars in the misty morning air. Ragnhild stood at the edge of the camp, her back to the fjord, gazing out at the horizon. The weight of her father's death, the burden of leadership, and the uncertainty of the future pressed heavily upon her. She had not slept since his pyre had burned, and her thoughts swirled like the mist that clung to the ground. Thorbjorn approached quietly, his footsteps nearly silent on the damp earth. He had stood by her side for so long, a constant presence in her life, but now even his steady demeanor could not ease the storm inside her. "You've been out here all night," Thorbjorn said, his voice low and filled with concern. "I needed to think," Ragnhild replied, her eyes never leaving the distant mountains. "There is so much to consider, too much." Thorbjorn grunted, his eyes scanning the horizon as well. "Aye, but thinking can only take you so far. The others are waiting for you. The clan needs its Jarl." At the mention of the title, Ragnhild's heart clenched. Jarl. The word felt foreign, like a mantle she wasn't ready to wear, but one that had been forced upon her. She had known this day would come, yet now that it had, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it dragging her down. "Do they trust me, Thorbjorn?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying her doubt. "Do they believe I can lead them?" Thorbjorn turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You've led them already, Ragnhild. You defeated Sigurd. You spared Hakon when others would have sought vengeance. You've shown strength and wisdom when it mattered most. They trust you because you've earned it." Ragnhild shook her head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "But I can feel the tension, the fear. They may follow me now, but if I make one wrong move, it could all fall apart. The other clans will always be a threat." Thorbjorn interrupted, his tone firmer. "That's the way of our world. You can't change that, Ragnhild, but you can make sure the Sverkers stand strong. And you will. She sighed, her breath visible in the cold morning air. I want more than just survival, Thorbjorn. I want peace. Real peace. Not this fragile truce built on the ashes of war. Thorbjorn's face softened. And that's why you'll succeed, because you want something better for your people. But peace is a hard thing to win, you know that. Ragnhild nodded, the fire of determination flickering in her chest. I know, and I'll fight for it, even if it means going against everything we've been taught. The council of elders and warriors gathered around the longhouse as the day wore on. They spoke in low murmurs, their eyes turning toward Ragnhild as she entered the hall. This was her first meeting as Jarl, and every face in the room carried the weight of expectation. Some of them had known her since she was a child, while others had fought alongside her in battle. They all had opinions, and many had doubts. Ragnhild stood before them, her spine straight and her heart steady. She couldn't afford to show weakness now. We've won a great victory, she began, her voice clear and strong. Sigurd the Wolf is dead. His forces are scattered. But I'll not lie to you. This victory came at a great cost. Many of our own lie in the ground, and we've lost much. But we've gained something far more valuable than land or plunder. The room was silent. Every pair of eyes locked on her. She could feel the tension, the uncertainty hanging in the air. We've gained the chance for peace, she continued, her voice rising with conviction. The cycle of bloodshed between us and the Gunners can end here, if we choose to make it so. Hakon Gunnar and I have fought as enemies, but now we have a chance to forge a new path. A path that doesn't lead to more graves, but to something greater. A murmur rippled through the hall, some warriors exchanging skeptical glances. One of the elders, an older man named Kjeld, stood and spoke, his voice heavy with doubt. And how do we trust the Gunners, Ragnhild? They've been our enemies for generations. How do we know this isn't a trick, a ploy to weaken us? Ragnhild met his gaze, her expression unwavering. You don't. There are no guarantees in this life. But I do not believe Hakon wants more blood. He's seen the cost of this feud just as we have. We either continue the cycle, or we break it. I choose to break it. Kjeld frowned, shaking his head. We've bled for this feud. Our fathers, their fathers, how do we let that go? Ragnhild's voice grew softer, but no less resolute. By remembering that our future is worth more than our past, we honor the dead by giving the living a chance to thrive, not through endless war, but through unity. For a moment there was only silence. The warriors and elders shifted uneasily, but Ragnhild could see the seeds of thought planted in their eyes. Thorbjorn, standing at the back, gave her a subtle nod of approval. Then from the doorway, a familiar figure stepped inside. Hakon Gunnar. The hall went deadly quiet as every eye turned toward him. He walked slowly, his face calm but guarded, knowing full well he was stepping into the heart of his enemies. His presence alone was a test, both for him and for Ragnhild. I came as you asked, Hakon said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history, to discuss a future without war. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Some of the warriors shifted, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Ragnhild raised a hand, stopping them before the situation could spiral out of control. Hakon has come in good faith, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. He stands before us not as an enemy, but as a potential ally. Kjeld's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and accusing. Why should we trust you, Gunnar? What oath binds you to peace? Hakon met Kjeld's gaze without flinching. I lost my father and brothers to this feud, just as you've lost yours. I have no desire to see more of my people die. But if you attack, we will fight. However, if there is a chance for peace, I will take it. Ragnhild stepped forward, standing beside Hakon. The gods have given us this moment. It is up to us to decide what to do with it, more blood or the beginning of something new. The silence was thick, the weight of centuries of violence pressing down on the hall. Then, slowly, one by one, the warriors lowered their hands from their weapons. Thorbjorn stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. If Ragnhild believes this path is the right one, then I stand with her, and I'll fight anyone who says otherwise. His words sent a ripple through the hall, and gradually others nodded their agreement. The tension in the air began to ease, though the wariness remained. Ragnhild let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. The hardest part was over, but the real work had only just begun. She turned to Håkon, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw something that resembled hope in his eyes. "Then it's decided," Ragnhild said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We forge this peace, together, for the future of both our people." That night, as the fires burned low and the hall emptied, Ragnhild found herself alone once more, standing beneath the stars. The cold wind swept across the land, carrying with it the distant howl of wolves. But this time, the sound did not fill her with dread. Instead, it felt like a reminder that while the road ahead was long and uncertain, she had taken the first step toward something greater than herself, something greater than vengeance. Håkon approached, his presence silent but reassuring. He stood beside her, looking up at the sky. "We've taken the first step," he said softly. Ragnhild nodded, her gaze never leaving the stars. "And now, we walk the rest." The wolves howled once more, and in the quiet of the night the future stretched out before them, fragile but full of possibility.